Hey,
What's up, buddy?
what's up, bro? How you doing?
Very well, thank you. About yourself? Having a good one?
Oh, yeah. I've been having a good one, you know? I actually,
Nice.
that's funny because last time we talked, uh, we started the conversation with you said, "How are you doing?" And I said that's a funny question because it's difficult for me to answer. And I think one way to contextualize that is that I just actually made a post, I want to say like an hour ago, where I defined being present as being able to experience the totality of whatever it is you're experiencing in that moment. And then I defined preference as a imaginary ability to pick and choose our sensations and what we're experiencing in that moment. So when someone says, how are you doing, zebra? It's funny to me because to me, I don't have any sense of an illusion that it could be good or bad because there just is whatever I'm experiencing in that moment. And in order to have a preference about our experience, we have to step back from it just a little bit and to judge whatever is happening. So I'm going to kind of make a cheap move there and use that very simple question as a way of jumping into the conversation again. And I'm going to leave it to you, Chris, to bounce off of that.
Awesome. Well, I do remember that when I was listening back to our last discussion, and I think that's a very. I believe last time I kind of followed up with a similar line. Also, it's a tricky thing to understand and to be in that place, what you just described. And I think last time I asked you if you could expound on maintaining that state of mind and what your idea of a thought process is when you're approaching something like that. For someone who's not familiar with Zen mind or the silence or whatever it is that you interpret that or call it.
Sure. So that's a good place to start. So when we're talking about Zen mind, I think something that people get finicky with me about is that I'm very particular about language. And a lot of people who are talking about these states of mind go, oh, it's something you can't talk about. And to me, that's just not true. And it's probably one of the reasons I think so many illusions have been created. I think perhaps more illusions have been created by people who are authentically awakened, if you want to put it that way, than people who aren't, because they talk about it in very careless ways sometimes they have to understand that anybody who isn't in that state where there's no filter between them and their experience has a filter that is going to translate that into their own understanding, and it's going to cause so many illusions. But I want to jump in on that question. So you said, how do you maintain the state? And the only honest answer for me to give you, and with the understanding that before I got to a place where I'm relatively stable in this place, I did all the different things, I meditated, I did yoga, I did a lot of psychedelics. I used divination instruments like the I Ching, which is from China. It's basically a book that you use to kind of, people say it's to predict the future, but to me it's an instrument you can use for self-understanding. I did all these different techniques, and what I've come to after all this time is that as soon as we ask, how is it that we get into a state of presence, it's a very tricky thing, because any way that you try to put yourself in a state of presence is already coming from a place where you aren't feeling present. And that's why, so we should look at the question when you say, how do you get into a state of presence? Where's the question coming from? There's something inside when we ask that question, when all of us ask it, that doesn't feel present already. But if we are present, then why do we need any technique to get into the present moment? So it's, for me anyways, a lot of what I try to do, and sometimes people find it frustrating because they want a neat and tidy solution, but there is none. But a lot of yeah, exactly. So what I try to do is I try to use what I would call mirroring to show people that all of their attempts to get to the present moment are the only thing which keep them from the present moment. So it's, to me, it's less about the right technique and more about letting go of the illusion that there's anything we can do to force ourselves into our own presence. And I'll let you riff on that.
Well, I think you bring up a very good point, and I guess for myself, at least on my quest, trying to understand these things, what they really mean, and be able to apply them in my life is what my goal is. And so, when I've been trying to seek what this means, how do I apply it in my life? These kinds of approaches, which is the way I approach things, which I know is very technical and not necessarily. Sometimes it hinders me when I try and be so logical about things. But I do think it serves a purpose to understand the difference between these different states, because I think what you're describing is simply being in the moment, no matter what it is. And I think for myself, I get confused even still sometimes if I don't catch myself in controlling the moment and manifesting my destiny that I want, like my reality. Controlling my emotions and just being in the moment. Those things all kind of exist together. They conflict and or work together depending on your state of mind. And so I think what I would like to know is your opinion on, see how I phrase this. How do you feel about controlling yourself while you're being in the moment? And what are your thoughts on taking personal responsibility for your attitude in the moment so that you can create a presence no matter what's going on in your life? And how does that work with what you were describing when you actually aren't trying to be anything other than what you are? How do you put those two puzzle pieces together?
Oh man, I don't know if you could have asked me a more perfect question.
I love this subject. This is really important for people to understand because it's life. It's every moment of life. It's how to be powerful, moment to moment. And it's been a personal quest of mine to find understanding on it. So I'm really glad to hear the things that you have to say.
Yeah. So the idea of control, I feel that this is, in some ways, it's really the, your paper is really loud.
Sorry, I took my necklace off. It was bound up in my headset.
Oh, no worries, man.
That's what was making all that noise. The dang thing off. It was all tangled in there.
No
We
worries.
got it now.
Cool. All right, so the idea of control. I feel, and I've said this many times before, control is a central illusion from which all illusions come from. And when I had my awakening, if you want to call it that, and it's even a finicky word to me, but when I had that, one of the first things that struck me, and it's difficult to even call it a realization because it's not a realization in which the instrument we use that we call our mind to acquire knowledge is somehow absorbing some new information. That's how we're used to thinking of learning something or having a realization or a revelation. For instance, we realize some meaning we hadn't seen in one of our favorite books or movies or music. And that's one way of realizing something, but it's only on the level of the mind. The realization I'm talking to is the next rung up the ladder from the mind. On a whole different level, I was struck completely with the fact, struck so completely that there was no way to unstrike myself. Right. And it's funny because you laugh because that's familiar immediately. We all have ways of avoiding realizing things that we don't want to realize. So you laugh immediately because some part of you goes, oh, I know that trick I pull on myself, and so exactly. So
that's the work, just is figuring out how to inch your way, becoming more and more real with yourself about reality.
Exactly.
It's tricky.
So I was struck completely with the fact that not only had I ever really been controlling myself, that I was completely incapable of really controlling myself. And the way I've described this to other people is that I realized that the sensation that my brain was somehow in charge of my body, that my mind was somehow in charge of my body, that this sensation of piloting ourselves around, of picking and choosing one action over another, this feeling of ambiguity and indecision that haunts us when we have the sensation of control. I realized that was all a conditioned illusion. And when I say realize, I mean that immediately this illusion crumbled. The sensation of being able to control myself crumbled. And there's no way out of that. I've joked before that awakening is not an accomplishment, it's bottoming out. What happens is that all this time you've been finding so many different ways to manipulate your experience. You've been doing all sorts of different things to try to better yourself, to try to basically manufacture a certain way of relating to the world, manufacture a certain outcome from the people and events around you, to manipulate the situations and agents in them, and have the sense that you somehow are in control of your own actions. And this is really the illusion that disappeared for me. So it's a difficult question for me to say. For me, I would say that it's impossible to truly have the sensation of controlling yourself and to be completely present in the present moment at the same time. You can't have the two sensations at once. If there's a sensation of controlling yourself, then some of your psychic and physical energy, you could say, is being used to maintain this illusion that the brain is steering the body. And when that energy is being used to create this illusion, it cannot be used where it would otherwise be used, which is just to be able to experience what's going on around you through your senses. So well, I'd say that's really the illusion we need to let go of. And immediately, I know the reaction always is when I say this, people go, oh, but if I stop controlling myself, can I be trusted? What am I going to do? Am I going to go out there and be, a complete fucking rapscallion? And this really, I think, is more of a comment on how we've been taught to view ourselves. We view ourselves as somehow mistrustful, as somehow really savage. So we've been taught to control ourselves because we view our own nature as something which is inherently wrong. And it's that sort of Catholic guilt, as they call it. And in my experience, and that's all I can speak from, is that whenever I'm not controlling myself, whenever I don't have that sensation, I seem to be much more capable of doing the things I'm doing anyways. And whenever I have the sensation of controlling myself, there seems to be some sort of, I've called it constipation before. There's a sort of constipation when you're not sure which action to take, what to say and what not to say. We've been taught that this is somehow doing a moral good, that we're constricting and restricting ourselves for the betterment of those around us and to refrain from fucking things up. But what really is happening is that there's a sort of constipation in the machinery of the organism, of the human body, that's happening, and there's an indecision. It doesn't know how to act. If you were to go to your dog, for instance, and say, do you want this, hold out a dog biscuit for the dog to eat, and the dog didn't know whether it wanted the biscuit or not, there would be something wrong with that dog. But for humanity, when we go to do something and we take a lot of time to think over whether to do it or not, we've been taught to relate to this as a very sane way of handling the world, a very responsible way of handling the world. And this is the primary thing which I'm calling deeply into question, because a creature that doesn't know what it wants to do, doesn't know what it should do, isn't necessarily a good or morally superior creature. It's a confused creature. So I'll let you riff on that.
I would totally agree. I do think that kind of instinctual living I don't want to say properly, but in the best way that it could be, needs a program first. I mean, we all come to this world beautiful, pure beings, and then depending on what happens to us in our childhood, we slowly lose who we are, become divided from ourselves. And I think that's partly what you're saying is like a baby doesn't need to know how to laugh or how to smile, it has good posture, all these things that it eventually loses with bad habits and trauma. And I think that without the subconscious programming, just completely letting loose, like let's say somebody who's not very well educated, doesn't know how to take care of themselves very well, and they just stop trying. It may not end up very well. They may end up very animalistic. I do think that there's a need for rudimentary contemplation and education. And once that foundation is laid, I would wholehearteddly agree with what you said. But I think people like, you've done the contemplative work. You're ready to let go. You've reprogrammed enough of your mind and found some of your old belief structures crumbled. I've heard you talk about and write about. But not everyone's done that work. So what do you think about let's say, a beginner or an uneducated person who just hasn't been exposed to this, who's trying? What would your word to them be as far as what to do or not do? And what's your opinion on education level and the state of mind you were talking about?
Okay, that's a really good question. So first of all, when I say releasing trying, right? Releasing the effort. The fact is that it's really not possible to have this happen if we're not ready for it to happen. And someone, for instance, like you said, who stops trying, but really they fall into a ditch, right? They're down on themselves and stuff. There's still a conflict in themselves, so they haven't really released the effort. Because there's still an effort there to somehow change themselves. And that is where all their misery comes from, is the idea that they need to change themselves, and their sense of hopelessness, that they can't do that. That's still a subtle form of what I mean by effort. And I think I'm going to go further than that, though, because it's a really, really good question. When the mind becomes something that's a hindrance to us, when it starts causing us suffering, when it no longer helps us, that's the point where we're ready to let go. And it's the point that we're all getting to. Everything up to that point, all the education, as you put it, all the acquisition of knowledge and the piling and piling on of experiences and memories and all of this, all that's really happening there is that we're trying to situate ourselves into a sort of corner where we'll eventually have to surrender, eventually have to let go. It's a sort of, we're very tricky creatures. There's in some ways we're the best at tricking ourselves and than we are at tricking anybody else. So so that all the knowledge that I have, for instance, and I'm very well read. Like I'm mostly self-taught. I did go to university and stuff, but I mostly am self-taught in that I spent a long time, years out of school, researching all this stuff on my own. Read countless books and all this, and I think the primary value I got out of this is the same value I got out of psychedelics, the same value I got out of meditation. And that value was trying something, trying it thoroughly, and then realizing that it still wouldn't give me what I wanted. And that's what we're all going to find, because no matter at whatever point you're at, if you're striving to improve yourself, there's going to be a long road of an uphill climb and an uphill climb. And then eventually something's going to reach a climax where you realize that the more you try to do this, the more divided you get. It's like you said, that was exactly what I was saying, by the way. When a baby is born, it doesn't need to know how to laugh. It just laughs.
Mm-hmm.
But as it's grown up, as it's raised, we teach the baby, okay, it's okay for you to smile, but it's very wrong for you to feel upset. It's okay for you to entertain us. But I know that sounds fucked up, but it's just the way things are. But it's not okay for you to become a burden to us. As soon as the baby is acting out, we put it in another room and pretend it doesn't exist. So what does that teach the baby? It teaches it inside that some of those emotions and states which come to it are okay, and some aren't. And this automatically, as it's growing, will divide it against itself, because it will be taught that it has to pick and choose what it should express and what it shouldn't express. And in my view, if someone's listening to this and say, for instance, they're not ready to let go, then they won't let go. Even if they try to let go, they can't let go. There's something there that has such a momentum in it. There's this gravity of our own conditioning, right? That it gets such a gravity that eventually we don't know how to do anything but to fight ourselves in some way. Everything we do becomes another form of fighting ourselves. And it's like, I've compared it, one of my favorite comparisons lately, because I love metaphors and I love images, has been that of a Chinese finger trap. Because in a Chinese finger trap, you have both of your fingers in, and the more you try to pull them away, the more stuck they get. That's the exact same situation we're in with our attempt to become enlightened, right? Attempt to become awakened, is no matter what we do, it sort of increases our sense of being in self-conflict and fighting ourselves, even if we don't realize it at first. The net weight of all of it is that the impression that we were taught when we were young, that we have to be one thing and not the other, that gets increased and increased until it's blown into ridiculous proportions, which is all these images of saints and gurus as being these perfect human beings who have no human desires and everything. And that's such a con that they've played on the world that really needs to be addressed. They're some of the worst liars that there is. And I've known some of the types, and their idea that they promote that there's some way to transcend your animal nature, right? There's some way to transcend those desires, and that's something that should be transcended. It's only adding to this fire that's in us of trying to eliminate our own nature. And I'll tell you, please do keep trying to eliminate your nature. Anyone that's listening, you'll get to the point. It's the best thing you can do, because only through that will you get to the point where you realize how you fooled yourself. And when you realize how you fooled yourself, there's freedom right there, because all of a sudden you realize not only is there nothing you can do to alter yourself, that doesn't mean that you can't change. It means that real change is like I'll quote a Zen poem because I love it. I quote it all the time. It's that sitting quietly, doing nothing. Spring comes and the flowers grow by themselves. That's what real change is like. Your body all the time is changing. I've joked in an essay before that, some people call it age. We're all the time changing without even trying. Our bodies are changing all the time without even trying. There's this illusory layer to change that we think, but somehow by pitting our minds against our bodies, by pitting our control system against a system which is being controlled, somehow pitting the brain against the rest of the human organism, that we're going to do something miraculous and overcome ourselves. What ends up happening is that we get more and more divided until the point where we bottom out and the effort is released and we finally accept ourselves. And the thing is, I'm not arguing against any of these techniques, because all we can do to get out of this trap is to keep furthering the trap until we have to let go. And I really try to be as honest about this stuff as I can, because all the time, and I've had a lot of trouble with this when I was looking for this stuff. Like I said, everything people say about this state, it tends to create more illusions. I'm doing my best to talk about this stuff without creating more illusions. So if I were to say, well, okay, if you want to get to the present moment, if you want to be awake, what you have to do is yada, 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 1, 2, 3. All that's doing is giving more of the impression that there's some way for the mind to like you said, your logic sometimes gets in your way, right? For some way to logically, systematically control something which is by nature not logical. Like it's a natural human being that's there, and we're trying to approach it like a math equation. And that's really the source of all our suffering is right there, right in that kernel right there. And I'll give it back to you.
Well, I mean, I can't disagree with anything you said. I do think I have some theories and thoughts on that are very long. I don't want to totally get into those, but I really do think that there is something going on here, as far as this whole universe, the whole everything, the all. I think there is a physics to it and a purpose, and I think that. I guess to be really short, I think that over lifetimes we build almost like a video game character. We literally go through all these different experiences to gain different lessons and that build on our soul itself. And eventually that, goes on to other processes in the future. So it's hard for me to hear some of those things you say, even though that there's it's the truth. It's conflicting though, which one of the things I've had to just deal with is, in this three-dimensional universe, things are, generally speaking, more black and white. But anything above straight 3D, it's a multiverse. There's like multiple options that are all correct. My mind has a hard time wrapping around that. But I do think that what you're saying is correct. I also am trying personally to blend that way of viewing the world and interacting with it into also being productive and moving up the ladder, I guess, in the way that I see the universe. I do believe there's evolution in the soul. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, I really liked how you said, okay, anything beyond the 3 dimensions, right? As soon as you try to comprehend that, it becomes very confusing. And I think that's really the exact situation I'm trying to outline in relationship to ourselves is we have this thing that we call the mind, which produces thoughts and mental noise and these ways of relating to the world. But what I was joking to a buddy of mine who was over earlier, and he's always asking me questions and stuff about this stuff. I said, in some ways, my message is very apocalyptic because I'm saying apocalyptic in terms of the mind. Because what I'm saying is that all throughout history, we've been using this instrument, thinking that it was somehow helping us to understand the world. And in the end, it's incapable of understanding anything. And so what I tell people is I'm trying to get them to see that everything their mind does doesn't bring them any understanding. And it's been I don't know how long you've been alive, but I've been alive, if I can recall, I think a little over 24 years. And I've never come to any understanding by my mind, and I've used it for most of my life. I've never come to any understanding. I've come to more and more theories, more and more hypotheticals. And there's an unwillingness in us to realize that all of our hypotheticals really are hypothetical. All of our metaphors really are metaphors. And this is the apocalypse I'm talking about. It's a personal apocalypse we all need to go through, where we realize that all of the schema we've used to try to grasp life, all of the maps that we've used to try to describe the territory, as they say, none of them fit. Not one of those maps will fit. And as soon as you design a map, I guarantee you something will happen to you that contradicts that map. So I've joked that I often contradict myself. And I said, but this actually means that I'm more honest rather than less honest because everything is always changing, because my body is always changing, because my brain is always changing, because the world around me is always changing. For me to relate anything, that means that what I'm relating should change also. If I'm relating the same thing tomorrow as I'm relating today, then you can be guaranteed that there's an amount of dishonesty there, because what I've done is tried to create a map that will account for all experiences. There's no such map, and there never will be any such map. So my message is an anti-message, which I'm saying that everything that we've used to try to understand the world has failed at understanding the world, and it's come at the expense of the other species on the planet, and it's come at the expense of the world around us, and it's getting to be around a time where we really need to ask ourselves whether what we call progress is always progress, or whether what we call progress is a sort of derangement out of the need to have something other than what we are, the need to understand something other than what we are, and to get somewhere else other than where we are. And I'm not trying to be negative. I'm trying to be realistic, because only through encountering our shadows, I think we talked about this last time, only through facing the shadow, only through facing all the things we really don't want to look at, that's the only place that real understanding comes from. I love that Carl Jung quote where he says, enlightenment doesn't come by imagining figures of light. It comes by making the darkness conscious. So there's no saving string for us. There's no savior. There's no understanding that's going to rid us of all our problems. Only in understanding this fact are we going to be free. Only in understanding the fact that nothing we do is anything but futile towards the goal we've put before it will we be free. And there's a hidden positivity in what I'm saying, which is that we can overcome this sort of obsession we have. But there's a few dimensions to what you're saying. You're also talking about there's evolution, right? Of course there is evolution, and it's evolution works very much like how I said the flowers grow or the trees grow. The body is handling all of its own evolution on its own perfectly fine. It's come out of the swamplands, it's come out of the plains, and it's made it this far. And yet there's this thing that's hopped in. I've called it a hijacker before. The mind comes in, it's a hijacker, and it wants to hijack this process and say, okay, now I'm taking the lead. I'm going to direct this towards where it's meant to go. How is the mind meant to direct us towards the next stage of evolution? Because you have to know where you're going if you want to reach a goal. But do we really know? If we knew what the awakened state looked like, then we would never be looking for it. So from the get-go, we have no way of understanding what we're looking for, just an intuition that something is there, and perhaps glimpses, right? In Zen, they call that kensho. Kensho isn't full illumination. Kensho is a glimpse into your nature. And we all have those. I think definitely anybody who's going to take the time to listen to this in our sort of, I don't want to say circles, but sort of branching family is going to have had some kenshos. They're going to have had some glimpses into this understanding that there is another way to be. But there's a very big difference between a kensho, between a mystical experience, and between awakening. And awakening, as I described to you during our last conversation, it can't be said that it's a state or an experience, because all these things are fleeting. What's happening in awakening is that the fundamental way that we relate to all our experiences, all our concepts, everything has to change, because there's something that's realized about the nature of our concepts. And that's basically what I've been outlining to you, with that all of our models, everything, we think that we're building a model to try to help us understand the world. What happens is that we end up building our own prison cell. We get trapped in one way of relating to the world, and one way of describing the world, in one way, and say that we really do live in a multiverse, as you described it, or a plural reality rather than a unified reality. If that was the case, then the very pursuit of constructing any model is delusional, because a model is something which is trying to unify experience. What if reality, and I explore this a lot in my forthcoming book, which is called Elephant Tusk. What if reality is fundamentally plural? If reality is not unified on its base level, then how can we possibly say anything which is meaningful across all different states, all different experiences. And like I said, that's where the apocalyptic quality comes in. When I say apocalypse, I mean an end of the idea of intellectual knowledge. I'm trying to point out that there is no intellectual knowledge. There's no intellectual knowledge. There's only words there. And when we realize this, it strikes you. It's something that blasts through your mind. And there's nothing that can be made to make that happen. It's something that completely grips you. You suddenly realize this whole time you've thought that you had a compass, and there's no compass.
But there is a compass.
Yeah, it's just
the heart, my friends.
Yeah.
It's actually very interesting that you say that, because I think I really do believe in the heart compass. That was actually something that was shown to me. I used to be a youth pastor and heavily involved in the church when I was younger. Then I became an atheist. I'm just going to skip straight through to the good parts. And then I had this crazy experience, and I'm not going to go into it, but essentially my mind and my third eye, to a certain extent, was just ripped open. And I was shown some things by some beings. And one of the things they told me, because I was an atheist at that time, was God is real. He's just love, though. No one understands. None of the religions quite get it. God is just love. He is everything. Everything is love. And that was something that they bestowed an understanding, I guess, on me, because I didn't get it until then. And the other thing they gave me was literally the concept of the love compass. And they said that you can follow the love in your heart and know the truth in anything. And I didn't quite understand it at the time, but I use it all the time in my research to be able to confirm or deny certain possibilities. It's kind of like a divining stone or something like that. But I can know the truth about something just by following the love in it. And I think that was the beginning of my research. It actually was that fundamental aspect. And I've used it my entire life. I actually have hopefully some lectures on that stuff coming up in the next few years here. But anyways, back to what we're talking about, is that I think that there is an understanding to be gained, but it's not exactly something that we can hold in the moment. It's an attitude that we can use as we go through life, as in, like you said, just being in the moment and just feeling in the moment. But I really, I guess, I'm having a hard time not plugging that in with truly gaining something, because when I look back into my younger years, I definitely have something now more than I had back then. And I feel like I have gleaned things from my contemplations and postulation and discussions, with people like you. So I guess I keep getting stuck on when you're talking about there not being something more, because I know for myself, it's not something I can tell someone else, but it's something I can feel inside of me, an understanding on this or that, or my feelings about the world, or, you know what I mean? Like, it's not something you can convey with words. It's more of a concept that you can become. And I think that fits into what you're saying, but to me, it feels tangible, and it does feel like something I take with me on a moment-to-moment basis. And when I don't have that, that's when I slip back into bad behaviors and things like that. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay. Yeah. So when I say there is no compass, when I say that, I mean that what we've been using as a compass all throughout our history isn't an effective one. So it's not that there's nothing we can use to string us between all these different experiences, but it's that really the state of mankind right now is so fixated on this one instrument, which we call the mind, in which we try to use in all of our dealings with anything, that if I were to say to someone that, okay, your intuition, because that's what you're talking about, right? When you say falling in love, what you're talking about is another way of saying intuition. And if I were to Yeah, because like you said, it leads you to your research. You probably using your intuition without even knowing how you do it. You've come across the right information. You come across the right people, and I would never deny that. That's absolutely true. But the thing is, as soon as I go to tell somebody, okay, your intuition is your real compass, there's no way for that person to internalize that knowledge right off the get-go if their mind is still active, because the mind is so, it basically, the phrase I use most is co-ops. The mind will co-opt any experience we have and use it to try to sustain its illusions. There's, like I said, there's a gravity in that conditioned division. There's a gravity there that anything that comes into the human organism, any information, will be used by the mind to sustain its illusory frameworks. So the reason most, if you want to call them teachers, people who have experienced this, experiencers who have gone through this and who talk about it afterwards, some form foundations, and fuck them, because they've created so much fucking turmoil and illusions with whether they realize it or not. And or just people who talk about it, a lot of them take the approach, they say, okay, you could call it a positive approach. What they do is they try to give more information. So they say, follow your heart, not your mind. That would be a positive statement, because you're telling someone what to do or what's the right way. I've tried very specifically to avoid that approach. And you could call what I do a negative approach. Instead of giving someone an answer, I try to take away the question. So when someone would ask...
Is that way to approach them?
Yeah, exactly. And so I would agree that the intuition definitely is a very accurate compass. I've described before, and I think it's information everyone should know. It's just based on my experience, is that the intuition physically is associated with the solar plexus. And the solar plexus is a spot right in between your heart and your belly button. And so whenever we're acting for, they say, listen to your gut. It's literally quite true based on what I found. The problem is when all of our physical energy, all of our psychic energy is being used to maintain the illusion of control, to maintain the illusion that our belief systems describe reality, to maintain the illusion of a video game character, as you put it, that's been created out of all these experiences and memories. When all of our physical energy is being used towards maintaining that, we don't even really have the ability to tap into the deeper parts of our body, because all of the energy is being sort of co-opted, taken, or hijacked by this mental construct. It is, as someone I really admire, U.G. Krishnamurti, as he put it, he said that the mind is a self-protective mechanism. So it protects its own continuity as if it was its own sort of entity. And so all the time, all of our illusions, they take all of our experiences and they filter those experiences through a certain way of looking at them. And so I'm very wary of making what you would call positive spiritual statements, of giving anybody advice. Because as soon as I give someone advice, it's not only them who receives that knowledge, it's also this illusory system, we call it the ego, whatever. And as I defined to you last time, I'll define it again, because I think we both agreed it was a pretty succinct definition. I said the best definition of the ego I have is the sum total of mental noise in our experience at any moment. So whenever someone receives positive spiritual advice, what happens is that this mental construct takes it and immediately takes all that information and converts it into its own form of understanding. And this is what, right before this talk, you mentioned to me, when you read my blatherings online, frequently you misunderstand it at first, and it takes a while to soak in and the real understanding to come through. Part of the reason for this is as soon as you read something, this instrument, the mind, takes that information and it converts it into a sort of watered down, digestible format, which is only based on its own limited perspective. And this is the problem with belief systems, is that anything we experience when we're under the influence of a belief system will automatically be converted into something which that belief system is comfortable with something that the belief system can digest, with something that makes sense to the belief system. So immediately when something confronts a belief system which is alien to it, which is unaccounted for by it, which doesn't line up with its fundamental assumptions, what happens is instead of integrating that into its structure, it will lash out against it. And it will go, oh, this person's nuts. This person's crazy. This person, you see this happening a lot. It will try to avoid the political shit, but you see this happening a lot in the political cloud, is a lot of people, as soon as everyone who someone disagrees with politically is automatically a monster, you know? And everybody who someone agrees with politically has the right view. And this is a very dangerous way of looking at things. I find it much better. So that's why I avoid giving advice, is because as soon as I make the assumption that my view is right and that there's a wrong view, then that's just also furthering this war that's going on, this battle that's going on between our assumptions and what we actually experience, between the mind and the body, so on and so forth. So yeah, it's a very long-winded reply, but what you were saying, that there is this sort of intuition, your heart, your gut, whatever you want to call it, that you can follow. Yes, but I would not advise anybody to try to follow it, because as soon as they try to follow it, what's going to happen is that their mind is going to substitute its own form of that understanding. And we had this difficult situation where we get into where we think that we're following our gut or following our heart, and we could be just following an old program that has used that understanding. So in some ways, you could argue that I'm trying to end the illusion of spiritual teachings, because as soon as you get it, and I'm saying this as someone I went to school for comparative religion. I did studies in comparative mysticism. So I'm not making this statement from a point of naivety or nascence or just being acquainted with this. That in my own experience, the idea that another being can somehow give you the right answer to your own struggle with yourself, it's a very dangerous slope, man. It's a very dangerous slope, because there's an inevitability that whatever I say to you and whatever you say to me is automatically and to some extent going to be misconstrued. There's a deeper part of us, a deeper intelligence in the body, as I put it, an intuitive knowledge that will understand what's really being communicated. But as you said, it doesn't come across in words. It comes across in an innate sort of intuitive knowledge. And I would never advise someone to try to tap into this intuitive knowledge, because, as I said, every attempt to try to get into this knowledge will lead you astray more. In our natural state, and I prefer the phrase natural state, as U.G. Krishnamurti did, to any other of these crazy phrases like enlightenment, so on, so forth, liberation, awakening. Natural state is less lofty. When we're in our natural state, all this knowledge is completely spontaneous. There's no need for effort to understand something which you understand, right? If you're trying to understand something which you understand, then you don't understand it. But if there's an understanding that's already there, it should express itself naturally, and there should be no effort. Just as we find when we talk, that the talking itself is actually very effortless. It seems to construct itself. I've had this experience as a artist, a writer, and I also make music and all these other things. It's besides the point. The point is that what I found is every piece of work that I've been happy with has seemed to build itself, has seemed to come out naturally, has seemed to be relatively effortless. There's some mistaken idea that all the good accomplishments come about by effort, that Mozart, when he sat down to compose his symphonies, was really fucking straining to make that shit come out. To me, that's constipation. uh, Anything that is really understood by us, it doesn't need effort. So I'm trying very carefully. It may sound like I'm talking in circles, but I'm trying very carefully to avoid the formation of more illusions about this, because every piece of positive spiritual advice we give, in the end, will be misconstrued. So my creative solution has been to try to mirror the ways that we can't understand these things. Because I know that as soon as that illusion crumbles, I know from my own experience, as soon as that belief structure crumbles, there's going to be an understanding that was always there to begin with, that was always just clouded over. So it's a very, in my opinion, there's been a lot of gurus, a lot of teachers who have tried to give positive spiritual advice, perhaps with the best intentions. You know, they say the road to hell is paved with best intentions. And I don't know how many enlightened beings have ever come out of a satsang. I don't know how many enlightened beings have ever come away from these teachings. In fact, what you end up seeing is, even with the least dogmatic person, you end up with something like Christianity, which is takes an enlightened being's phrases, their sayings, and uses it as a dogma. My interest is in doing whatever I can to end the creation of this dogma, because the dogma has been used all throughout history as a way of controlling each other. It's always been used in some way to try to convert our fellow man into slavery to some sort of cosmology, some sort of idea, and that's been called the right way, the right understanding. And oftentimes these dogmatic understandings come from a real place. They come from a real understanding, and that's why they are so effective. But the problem is, as soon as you try to convert a real experience into something which is transmittable, into something which someone can pick up and immediately understand on their own, it's doomed to become another belief system. And that's been what I think the lesson we really need to take away from all these great teachers of mankind is that even though they had the best intention, even though they were probably very awakened beings, what has been the result of their teachings has not been a planet of enlightened beings. It's been a planet of beings under the influence of different dogmas that use these dogmas to control each other. And so I try very, very hard to avoid creating any sort of doctrine out of what I've experienced, because I know, I'm not saying that people are going to fucking worship me. There's no reason to. I'm a fucking monkey. But I'm saying that no matter what, there's these projections involved. So if I were to go out and create a teaching based on what I experience, create a doctrine, then inevitably it's going to be used for the wrong purposes, specifically because we have this mind thing which co-opts all of our understanding. And I know I've been talking for a while, so I'll let you go now.
That's all good. It's an important topic. I definitely have several things I could say all throughout the different points. I guess we're going to have to take different sides a little bit, or agree to disagree would be a better way to put it, on a few of those things. I really think that there are I think that there's a couple main points that I would just point out instead of disagreeing with anything. I think that just because it hasn't been done right before doesn't mean it's not possible. And I think to back up that statement a little bit, I believe that looking at the evolution of consciousness and mankind and well, everything, looking out at the world around us, to me, in my personal research, I've seen a big link in evolutionary processes. They all seem to kind of work the same. And one major thing that I found that really brought some clarity to mind in my mind is that everything works in an evolutionary process. It's vortex mathematics, essentially. It's a toroidal shape, and our entire universe is built on that concept. It's the yin yang, the black hole, the white hole. There's energy going from one into transmitting into the other, and then up and around, transmitting back into the other, in this back and forth flow. And even time itself seems to move in waves. Everything's wave shaped. There's the sacred geometrical mathematics you could bring into it, but that's a whole different thing. But essentially, the main concept, the way that the universe seems to work in every single system, is a kind of a give and a take. And there's something in there called a bifurcation point in all evolutionary processes, whether it be biological or social. And that bifurcation point is a stressor. And the stress is actually what fuels evolutionary process. If everything is totally comfortable, evolution actually has no need to kick in. It's that stressor that the system comes up against this stressor point, and it's almost like a membrane. And everything is really hard, and your system is breaking down. It can't handle whatever is going on. Either the social situation, it's not quite equipped, or if it's biological, it doesn't have the biology to handle this threat or this stressor. And so it's forced to upgrade and become more complex. Or the other option, or is it downgrades and becomes less complex, dumbs down. And that's for every process that exists in the stars, as far as I'm aware of it. And so I think that these problems we come up against when we get locked in these situations, they're actually beautiful gifts. They're the stress and the heat that makes the diamond. And that's where I think it all kind of fits into like this beautiful ebb and flow Fibonacci sequence thing. It's like it eventually goes way beyond the mind to comprehend. But I think what's applicable for us is that these stressors and these points of lack of understanding, these traps, they're here to help us to work around these things and overcome our shortcomings and our thought processes and the way that we live our lives so that we can become more complex. And so I personally see where everyone's at, whether they're able to contemplate these things or not, or if they're ready to move past where they're at. It just depends on what bifurcation point they're up against in their personal evolution. And the stressors can be used and overcome to strengthen us, or we can break down. But I think that they're a part of the plan, and that I don't think we should get stuck in mind traps. But I think as you go through the process of slowly gaining more understanding and ability to navigate the world, there has to be some sort of understanding on the mechanics of it. I guess I don't want to keep going too much on that, but I think that the balance between logical and intuitive, feminine and masculine, the being in the moment, and the not binding to a dogma, but also processing and contemplating and understanding, those things have to be married together, or I think either track loses its way and becomes unbalanced. I guess that's all I really have to say. As far as what you were just speaking of, there's a few other points in there, but it's,
I can bounce off of that. There's a lot of good stuff in there.
Awesome.
All right. So, yes, and I know totally what you're pointing at. So basically, what you're saying is through the traps, through the confusion, that's where our understanding comes from. It's only from being tricked that eventually we can understand the opposite of the trick. It's only through being hazy that we can become lucid. It's only through being fooled that we can learn how it is that we get fooled, and so on and so forth. And I think it's an excellent point. The thing is, I guess the one maybe positive, what I call a positive assertion I might make during this, is I think that we really have reached that point. We're reaching that point where all the pressure that's built up in what we call human history has gotten to the point where we need to release these old ways of relating to each other in the world and let go. I could be wrong about that, but it's what my intuition tells me. So there's another part of this where I frequently come up against, because what I'm doing is basically dismantling assumptions, right? That's what my talent is. I frequently come up against the argument that don't pick these assumptions apart because they're also part of the harmony. Well, the thing is, if all of us were to look at every issue, if you want to call it an issue, outside of ourselves and say, oh, it's just part of the harmony, then none of us would be getting anything done. And also, that harmony, I really want to stress, would cease to function. Because if the harmony and quote-unquote being aware of itself starts saying, oh, it's just a harmony, let it happen, it's what needs to happen, and there was nothing new introduced, then it would become stagnant, and it would be like a machine choking on a gumball. And I feel that's also part of what's happened right now, is that we have all these old systems, and like I said, their function has been to eventually get us to release them, to eventually get us to see how they aren't the answer. So I would agree that there's an evolutionary, or to use a philosophical term, a teleological purpose. Teleology, for those who don't know, is a philosophical idea that a process is directed towards a specific end. To use the image of a gumball, if I put 5 cents into a gumball machine, there's a teleology towards that process where the gumball is going to come out the little slide at the bottom. The other dimension of teleology is that it's specifically a meaningful process. So the gumball machine, I don't know if it's the best metaphor, but human evolution, I would argue, is a teleological process. It's going towards a certain end, and every end is always a new beginning also. So yes, I would agree that there's no way to avoid these traps. But I think it'd be very misleading to say, therefore, we should keep making traps. That's a jump that I just cannot make. If we go on doing the way things were done before, we're in for a rude awakening. We're in for an awakening either way. If we want it to be rude, we can keep putting pressure on the natural system, keep putting pressure on the availability of resources, and also on the tension of all of us as we try to hold on to these illusions. There's a lot of insanity happening on the planet right now, specifically because we're all in a great effort to hold on to the illusions that the past has given us. And you see this a lot in the political cloud, as I called it before, where I think we're all slowly coming to a realization that a lot of these political systems are very archaic, they're very outdated, and there's this struggle going on where those in power, if you want to call it that, are trying to maintain the illusion that we need those same governmental systems as we did back then. And those that are the citizenship are trying to maintain the illusion, the same illusion that they need that system. So there's people who are very fanatical about, for example, participating in voting or whatever. Nothing you vote for is going to fix what the real issue is, because the issue is that we have all these traditions, and all these traditions have become maladaptive. As I've said it before, you can look at a lot of our traditions, at a lot of our habitual ways of relating to the world. They're like vestigial organs. So like, for example, what's a good example? Appendix. The appendix, right? You don't technically need it to survive. I think I'm right about that, right? But yeah. So you can get it removed and you'll keep functioning fine. Perhaps you'll even function better if you have stones or a gallbladder, right? If you have stones in your gallbladder. I say this because my stepfather just got his gallbladder removed. They found a bunch of stones in it. The mind's a lot like that. It has all these false understandings, all these belief systems that we've accumulated throughout our history. And what we're being asked to do on a very intuitive level is to let these go, because they're, like I said, they're making the natural harmony into a machine choking on a gumball. It's stuttering. And we need to understand that whenever we talk about the harmony of things, that harmony can only function if we participate as an active agent of it. The harmony completely breaks down when everybody starts going, oh, well, there's a reason for everything, and using that as an excuse not to confront their illusions. It's a very dangerous thing to say, oh, because these illusions have performed this function, then we shouldn't try to figure out what's illusion, what's real. Then we shouldn't keep creating more systems that work in the same way. If I were to create a system based on my experiences, I'd be doing the exact same thing that the Buddha did when he returned from his voyage into the jungle and all over the world, and came back to the Sangha monks and said, I have attained the supreme knowledge or enlightenment or whatever. And they all took his words and created an oral tradition about it, and they passed it on, and then it became this whole academic fucking thing. And I think that instead we should take the position of Nagarjuna, who was the founder of Zen. And do you know what Nagarjuna said when he awoke? He said, I take all of the Buddha's teachings and use them for toilet paper. So there's this progression that goes on where anything new only comes into existence by rejecting the modes that brought it up to that point. And there's an archetypal or symbol of this, which is, slaying the father. It comes up in a lot of myths. What it is that thing that got you to the point where you are, you're eventually going to have to turn around and slay that thing for you to go any further. And I feel that's really the position we're in with not only all of the spiritual teachings of the past, but all of our intellectual knowledge. There's this pressure that's been building where we need to take the next step, and all that this has become is a form of habit. It's a form of cognitive habit. It's a form of dogma. There's many, many people buying into, one second, I'm going to take a sip of water. Buying into this neo-Advaita, which is non-dualism. And what they do is to take it, and they go around, they have a mystical experience or two, and then they say that, oh, enlightenment's realizing that all is one, blah, blah, blah. This has become complete excuse to not actually experience it yourself. That's why I talk against the very idea of a spiritual teaching, is it gives us an excuse not to do that search ourselves. And the only way that we're going to come to that state is through our own resilience, through our own curiosity, through our own bravery, if you want to call it that, and through our own willingness to be wrong. And so it's not that I disagree with you. I think it's an excellent point you've made, Chris, about this point that's there where the confusion is also an instrument of a higher harmony. Yes, that's true, but if you realize what it is that's confusing you, you would not be playing your part to go on pretending that, therefore, okay, let's just keep everything that's confusing. No, when you realize what it was that's confusing you, you need to be Nagarjuna and wipe your ass with whatever it was. And the specific example of Nagarjuna is he had all these teachings the Buddha gave of all the constituents of mind. And the Buddha called them sometimes dharmas or aggregates. And he said, there is no aggregates because the mind's illusory. So that's the reason he said he would wipe his ass with the Buddha's teachings, because the Buddha created this very complex numerical system of trying to relate how the mind operates. And so what Nagarjuna is saying is that all this complexity has only served to confuse people about their own nature. So in some way, it's a hidden form of love. I have a friend who recently said on Facebook, he said something about how the figure of Judas, who is the one who betrayed Christ and reported him to authorities, in some ways he's one of the most important, because what he did is he set into place this whole historical process that's come into place. So we all need to, at some point, have the bravery to acknowledge our heroes, to acknowledge our idols, and then to say, fuck you, and to slay that attachment to our idols. And that there's also a koan in Zen they use that says, if you see the Buddha on the road, kill him.
I have that book.
Oh, yeah? Yeah, and
Somewhere up here, yeah.
It took me years to understand what that actually meant, but when I got to the point where, I won't get into this whole thing, but where...
Sheldon B. Cobb. Yep.
Where I got to the point where the Buddhist teachings for me also, because I really studied Buddhism. I'd say the only thing I really studied more academically than Buddhism was Jungian psychology, and then Buddhism, and then other mysticisms and stuff. But it got to the point for me with Buddhism where I also had to kill the Buddha, which means my own idolatry, and also my feeling that the Buddha somehow knew something that I don't know. And that there's also a lot of that in these circles, that I'm trying to make all this conversation into something very commonplace, because it's really something universal that we're talking about. It's really not high and lofty. You aren't a god if you're a Buddha. What all you are is a human being who understands their own nature. And all this myth making that's gone on around it, making it into this high goal to attain, has done nothing for us but set us further at war against our own selves, against our own desires, against our own nature. And there's some feeling that somehow, if we wiggle just the right way, like I said, we can make ourselves stop being selfish. We can make I think we talked about this a little last time. We can make ourselves stop being selfish, or we can make ourselves stop being manipulative or anything. There's no way, as soon as you try to stop manipulating, you are also manipulating. And that's what I mean by the finger trap. You're trying to solve the problem with the problem. As Einstein said, you can't solve a problem from the same level of consciousness that created it. So that's the situation I would outline. I really liked your point. So that's my tit for your tat, and I'm going to let you have a tat for my tit.
Well, the only real big thing that I really wanted to go over that I think explain or puts things into context with some of these things is, for me at least, is when we're talking about trying to understand things, or self-honesty, or even being in the moment, being in this state, it requires something that I actually haven't found a lot of literature on. But I've done a lot of flipping thinking on it, and I think that the actual ability to really want it, like it's willpower, to have the actual, because sometimes we'll think like on a surface level, like in your mind when you're actually thinking like, yeah, I want this, but it's a conflict like in your heart, and making your whole being be something or want something, or like, truly seek the answer. That really brings in self-honesty, and then dealing with reality and all these other concepts. And when someone truly seeks the truth, and it's their whole being, it's totally different when they listen to something than someone who really doesn't want that. And that's, I think, what makes the dividing line on a lot of this stuff that hasn't worked in the past. There's an approach to it that must be taken to actually be able to see through these veils, to gain this knowledge and then transmute it into wisdom. That's the difference between wisdom and knowledge. And the attitude of the seeker, if you're going to get the amount that you want to get. And if something's going to push your reality past what you're comfortable with, even on a subconscious level, if you haven't done the work to bring that stuff into your conscious being and be aware of it and observe it, which most people haven't. They kind of exist on this automatic mode. You're not going to be able to reach the depth of understanding of someone who really puts their heart and soul and contemplates something and wants to glean more of that knowledge. And I think that a lot of these things actually would work, these concepts of bringing understanding to the person who has the mind to understand, who truly seeks. And information builds on information. The more you seek, seek and ye shall find, which is I forget where it is in the Bible, but the really cool thing about that is there's more to that. And it's seek and ye shall find. When your heart and your mind are combined, then essentially you can navigate the universe correctly, is the gist of it. That's, I believe, actually I don't know which book that's in, but it was taken out of the Bible. I'll have to look that up. I think I have a copy of it. But that's part of the thing that I don't like about the Bible or some of these concepts is that they're not necessarily wrong or right, but what you get out of them is however much you want to know times where you're at. As far as understanding, how much information and contemplation have you really sought? Because you're going to get more out of that, that time when your heart's open. And I think that changes the game. Makes a lot of these things that it sounds like you were saying are unaccessible to people. I think it really makes them accessible on a certain level. And also doing the work of not getting caught up in one understanding or getting caught up in a certain mindset, but perspective. It's another huge picture. And once you've done the self-honesty work, you shed your perspective, your filters, and then you can put yourself in all the different perspectives, because that's the way it is reality is multifaceted. And when you get into quantum realities of just interactions, there's not one right way and one wrong way. Sometimes there's a whole gray area, thousands of ways it could be, or that it is, and they're all true and right. And so some of these, I think they're the more advanced concepts for a lot of people, but I really think they hold validity in opening up some of these techniques and understandings to people. Is that fundamental effort, willpower, true desire, and that self-honesty work. The more you let yourself not be self-honest, the less accessibility you have to what actually exists out there, the more filters you have to defend your version of reality, because it's not going to hold up all the time. What do you think about that?
Well, yeah. Well, totally. In some respects, I totally agree. I'm not even sure if there's a respect in which I would disagree. It's just that, as always, through my own weird idiosyncrasy, I'm probably going to define it in my sort of weird, trippy way. So
that's perfect.
Which is, of course, why we're talking. So we can both shoot back and forth. And so, yeah, that's part of what... First, I'm going to tackle the idea that you said there's not one right or wrong way, which is a theme we've been sort of harping on in this podcast or talk. And that's really such a fundamental point that I'm making, is that because we all have different roles in the tribe, if you want to call it that. The tribe's not the right word. In the species, how can one person with one role teach another person another role? You wouldn't ask a carpenter to teach a fisherman how to fish, and you wouldn't ask a baker to teach a fireman how to fight fires. It's the same role or same general theme on a wider scale. We all have unique individual bodies. And I sort of go into this a little in my novella, which is called The Indwelling, and that's available for free on YouTube as an audiobook, name dropping. And so we all have individual bodies. And so every individual body is programmed to perform a certain function for the species. It's the idea that comes in with the spiritual teachings, and also with all of our moral systems, with all of our legal systems even, is that there's some way to make one size of shoe fit on every foot. There's not going to be any way to do this. And this has really been such an experience of mine, is that really looked to all these wise figures. I looked to Carl Jung. I looked to the Buddha. I looked to fucking Lao Tzu. I looked to Jesus. I looked to all these people. And not one of them could tell me how to be myself. Not one of them could relay that understanding to me, because they can only speak from their own fishbowl, as I've been calling it lately. We're all speaking from our own fishbowl, our own self-contained projective understanding of the world. And as soon as you try to make your fishbowl into another person's fishbowl, that's where all the fucking problems in the world come from, in my opinion, is that illusion of control, which is being externalized onto another person. You say, this has been right for me, so it's going to be right for you. Out of that, we've created endless forms of violence against our own kind. Endless forms, and I don't just mean physical violence. I mean violence against our own ability to understand ourselves. There's been and often this is done by the people who have the best intentions. They go in and they say, wow, I've really freed myself from my confusion. Time to go out there and teach people how to free themselves like I did. I mean, all the power to you. Go and try that. But I would ask you, or anybody who has that sense, to deeply question whether that's even possible. Because how can an otter teach a fish to be an otter? It can't happen. The second part of what you... Yeah, exactly. Oh, no, it's okay.
But otters can teach other otters. There's lots of different types of people. If everyone tries to teach their own type of people and offer resources, we don't have to all stumble in the dark.
Well, the fact of the matter is that we are stumbling in the dark. This is what I'm trying to point out very, perhaps kindly. I'm trying to say we are stumbling in the dark. All of what we've used for intellectual knowledge throughout history, we call it fucking magnificent stabs of light into the world of understanding. And it's really just poking around in the dark because we really don't understand. We don't know why we're alive. We don't know what the purpose of our life is. That's why we're looking. And we don't know what we are or who each other is. As soon as we make the very difficult Band-Aid rip of removing the sensation and the assumption that we know all these things, I guarantee you, at least for me, that's the caveat I'll put, at least for me, when I released the sensation that I knew these things, when I accepted that I was stabbing around in the dark, then the dark became a home to me and didn't feel as dark anymore. In fact, it's all I've ever known. All I've ever known is that I don't know what reality is. I don't know what the world is. I don't know what the universe is. So all these people have very big statements about the universe. They say the universe is Brahman. The universe is infinite consciousness. The universe began with a big bang. All of these cosmologies, I would say, how does that taste on your tongue when you say it? Does it really feel certain? Do you really feel certain when you say that the universe began with a big bang? Do you really feel certain when you say what reality is? Be honest with yourself. As you said, be honest. Be honest when you say these things. How do they feel? You know, we all know when we're putting on a front. We all know when we're pretending to speak for something we don't know. And that's, I've spent a lot of time in academic circles, and that's all the rage in those circles, is to pretend to know things you don't know. Sorry, just taking a sip. 1 second.
Okay.
Sorry. And so the limits of our knowledge is really what I'm trying to make clear. You will only come to knowledge through accepting the limits of your knowledge. All that we can know, in my view, is ourselves. For our whole life, all of our lives, we've only known ourselves. And I don't mean intellectually. I mean, it's what we are. So we have to spend all our time with ourselves, no matter where we are. And the problem becomes when we try to make our limited knowledge about ourselves, about the world, and we try to make something which is fundamentally very, very, very mysterious into something which is readily digestible, prepackaged McDonald's food that you can eat. If I were to go out and say reality is this or that, all of that, I will not create any understanding with that. Even if I give my best understanding of it, I guarantee you there will be no understanding with that. So instead, what I say is I've come to know myself in this way. If you can take something from that, then do it. If there's nothing for you there, then please forget I exist. Please forget that you ever heard me speak. Because you will only create more troubles for yourself, and I'm not trying to create troubles for anybody. I'm trying to be very mindful in talking about this stuff at all of the best way to approach it. And there's only a certain degree we can ever do that. But I can only base that on the ways that I was tricked. And I want to jump quickly, Chris, to what your concept of self-honesty, right? Self-honesty is a very important concept, I think. Like all concepts, it's bound to be misunderstood as well. To me, what would I say self-honesty is? I'd say self-honesty, it really comes naturally from what I was just saying. Self-honesty is the ability to admit the limits of what we know. Self-honesty is the ability, ultimately this is what it is, it's the ability to admit that there are some things we just don't know. And it's the ability to admit also that there are certain things we do know, which is that we do know on some level, we do know when we're putting on a front. And we do know on some level, we know when we're outstepping our boundaries and we're trying to speak for something specifically for our own self-aggrandizement. And I know this better than anyone because I work with this material, which is the fundamental understanding of yourself. There's nothing more hot than that in life to touch. So it brings all sorts of projections. I get people who call me a guru. I get people who call me a demon. I get people who call me a confused schizophrenic, There's all these things. And the thing is, I have to be very mindful when I'm getting projections like that, not to let those projections become my motivation. So that to me is self-honesty. It's admitting that we are fundamentally pleasure-seeking creatures. We are fundamentally pain-avoiding creatures. And that a lot of what we do under the guise of a moral banner, under the guise of helping others, is actually to help ourselves. Only through understanding that fundamental fact about our nature is there any possibility of going above it. If we try some way to drive it out of ourselves, it becomes stronger. And this has been seen over and over again throughout history. Moral crusade after moral crusade. The people become so convinced of the ability of whatever it is to better the world that they use that betterment to further their own interest. And they use that betterment as a form of control against other human beings. And they'll say, this is for your own good that I'm doing this. So to me, self-honesty is something very specific. It's the ability specifically to admit our limitations and also our illusions. To admit when we're putting on a front, because we all know the feeling of putting on a front. I tell you, it's in our nature to be very talented with mask, to be very talented with costumes, to be very talented with appearing one way and actually meaning another thing. To say, hey, I'd love for us to hang out sometime and actually have other intentions with that person, that you're trying to get something out of them. It's very deeply ingrained into us. So self-honesty, to me, it needs to be admitting that. And only when you're at the point where you have no crusade left, you have no moral banner left, you have no point to make, and no belief system to expound, only at that point do I feel that you will truly be able to help another person. Because that's not to say, for instance, if I help someone with their car, they're broken down, and I say, okay, I'll put down what I'm doing and I'll come pick you up. Sure, that's a relative help to that person. But when I talk about help, I'm talking within the context of self-understanding, of overcoming psychological suffering, of overcoming one's conflict with oneself. That's the real help that we should be trying to give ourselves, and then, only then, trying to help others with. Only then. You can't do that if you have some motivation. If you have some, specifically in the sense of having a flag to wave around, you know? If you have some ideology about what you're doing, I guarantee that the devil on our right shoulder will use that, and it will say, okay, now you have this power, and you won't even necessarily know you're doing it. I've been as guilty of this as anyone. That's how I know. I know the darkness of our species only from speaking the experience of my own darkness. And the only time you'll really be effective in freeing somebody else is when you are free from the idea that you can or should free somebody else. As soon as you have the idea that you should do something to somehow better, to somehow improve another person, to somehow, even to somehow enlighten them, if you have that idea, you will not be effective. You'll create more confusion than you create understanding. And all the times that I've had any luck with someone going, oh wow, something just clicked, and all of a sudden they're in another state, I can feel they've shifted. Anytime I've had any luck with that is when I was absolutely not trying to do it, and I had no expectation that I could or should do it. And all the times that I've failed in doing that has always been when I thought, oh, because I understand this, I really ought to get this information out there for this or that reason. It's a very subtle thing. It's very tricky waters to work with. And obviously, as you point out, there's no possible way that we can do anything without creating some suffering, without creating some illusions, without creating some confusion, some self-conflict, some discomfort. There's no possible. If you try to do that, you're going to be catatonic, right? You're going to be stuck in a corner, not moving. You're going to be one of the people who can't walk on the beach because they're worried that they're going to step on a clam, you know? And that's the difficulty, is there is a balance in it. The balance is very inobvious. It's only something that you can figure out through your own trial and error. And whenever a good measure I've found in my own experience is whenever I'm doing something because some thought in my head, specifically some thought in my head says, oh, you ought to be doing this. That's the wrong time to act. As a friend of mine on Facebook put it once, he said, when you don't know what to do, or when you think you know what to do, when you think you know what to do, sit still. When you know what to do, act. If you think you know what to do, chances are that's coming from your conditioning. There's no such thing as an enlightened thought. Even the most profound thought is not presence. Even the most profound iota of mental noise is not identical to your true state. So, yeah, self-honesty is seeing when these signals come up from our conditioning, and instead of following that trail, being honest and saying, this is coming up for this or that reason. I'll let you talk because I know I'm rambling at this point, but a great example in my own experience is I'm a very big veteran of anxiety. I had a very intense panic disorder for 3 years before this thing happened to me. Now and then I'll get anxious now, but it's very infrequent and is like mostly obliterated. But when you're anxious, there's a tendency to try to find something to distract yourself. You'll try to say, oh, I should go see if this person wants to hang out, or I'll go watch this show or something. And this is a way of looking away from what you're feeling and not confronting it. So self-honesty to me is when there's a situation like that, when we have an inner situation like that, admitting and fessing up to the fact that we are afraid, admitting and fessing up to the fact that we are being selfish if we want to put that on somebody else because we're uncomfortable with ourselves. That's to me is the root of self-honesty. The root of self-honesty is not puffing up your chest and trying to become selfless. The root of self-honesty is admitting the fact that we are all selfish. There's not one person among us, I don't care who it is. Point to the most enlightened man and I'll point to the streams of revenue he has coming in. There's not one person that doesn't possess some selfishness, and there's no way to completely overcome your selfish nature. There's only a way to accept your selfish nature and to have it find some harmonious position within your overall functioning, to have it find a rightful place rather than steering all the time. Yeah. All right.
Well, I definitely have to disagree with that last part. I think that there are ways to truly interact in a harmonious manner with your environment, but I think that the gist of what you're saying, I can definitely agree with. I think with most of the things tonight that you said that don't exist or are traps, I think that they can exist. It's just very hard, and most people won't ever be able to do it. I think that it's, for the most part, I really believe that the concepts you're describing are what should be sought. But I also think that if we look out, I like to try and model things off of nature and the natural programs that already exist. Because I really do believe that the core of all the universe is off the same energetic systems, just in different ways. And so I think that there are many different ways these things can be accomplished. And I think for some people, this Zen perspective is really beneficial. But I also think even just white bread Christianity is positive for some people. I think there's an infinite number of ways to walk the path and an infinite number of destinations. And I think that we're all here to do different things and different processes. But I also think that there is a general end to things, people want better lives. People want to be at peace. Happiness is actually a stressor too. Happiness and grief, they're both stressors. So this whole thing about being peaceful as opposed to trying to seek happiness, I think is a lot wiser. But back to what I was kind of popping off of, it's a different process for everybody, but these are really great tools, I think, to reach that goal. And for certain people, these things can be hindrances. For myself, I actually find a lot of these concepts and trying to seek them, trying them out, researching them, they really have helped me personally, but I've definitely been stuck on some too. So for myself personally, which is in the perspective that I can, I guess, properly perceive, I think that it needs to be a balance of truly seeking and being in the moment, but not letting yourself buy into these concepts as being true or the real reality. Because the way I see it, that's constantly shifting. And we're all kind of in our own reality, but also coexisting. Like it's so much more complicated than I think most of us can understand. And even at a very small level, they are seeing it's just so much more going on that it's just fruitless to try and control everyone's perspective or think that your perspective is the right one.
Yeah.
I mean, have you heard the concept that every point in the universe exists actually like energy forms cruising through the possibilities? Like in a video game where you're at on the map and what armor you and all your stats and everything, in a file somewhere, there's all this code that dictates all those points. And as you move through the game, where you are at that exact second, that's like your location. All the factors of what you're wearing, who you are, what kind of character you are, your development, those are all like factors in your quote unquote location. And I think that we're moving through all possibilities of possible everythings. And essentially that's why people's universes can be different, but we all kind of coexist and co-create this universe. I really think we're actually skipping universes every time we move or think, or anytime any kind of energy changes in our personal environment. I think it's actually a location change, quote unquote. And we're swimming in a multiverse of possibilities, but they're all right next to each other. So you can't just jump from one to like a drastically different one where everyone is dragons. They're all like side by side somehow. That's kind of a different tangent.
Yeah. So, okay, a few things. I have no issue with the idea that we live, like I said, in my forthcoming book, which I've been working on a long time. I really explore this idea of plural realities and also plural personalities, plural selves. It's really like one of the main themes in my book. And
oh, nice.
And so I have no issue with the idea that there's all these possibilities. My stubborn issue, my stubborn rebuttal, as always, is maybe we are in all possibilities, but what does this concept do for us? It's the same idea that I have with, or the same variation I have from all the mysticisms I've absorbed and studied is, and it should be said that, what is mysticism, just in case someone's listening and doesn't know? Mysticism is a way of trying to understand yourself through the instrument of experience. So it turns into religion, it turns into all these other things, but mysticism is specifically a way of using direct experience to try to arrive at a direct experiential shift. And call it whatever you want. And so when we talk about something that's, okay, we live in all possibilities, yeah, maybe we do. But what does it do for us really even to have this concept? And there's a lot of concepts like that I feel are out there. And one of them is this doctrine that I mentioned in Neo-Advaita, that everything is one. I think the idea everything is one might be the most disastrous thing to ever happen to mysticism and self-understanding. All it tends to do, and what I've seen, is that it tends to become a lens for avoiding the variations in your own experience. And it tends to become an instrument for self-dishonesty. People are not, the fact is that if we're suffering, we don't feel at one with ourselves. We don't feel that unity with things. And it's too easy to say that all is one. It's too easy to spout that doctrine and then claim that you understand what this core transformation is, if there even is a core transformation, right? That's part of what you're saying. There might be different goals as well. So it's not that I disagree with you, because I think that this in some ways is a better way of looking at things, but it's still a way of looking at things. And that's where the self-honesty comes in, where we have to admit the limits of our knowledge. If something in us can come to the understanding that no matter what, whether we're in a fucking self-contained toaster in some giant's kitchen or we're in a universe, or we're in a multiverse, or we're in a contraption of some sort that some mad scientist designed, a simulation, whatever. Whatever it is, what I'm trying to say very, very gently but directly, we have no instrument which can tell us what it is. Because even the question, what is this, is from the perspective of something which isn't part of that system. So I think it's better to understand how it is. How do you feel towards yourself? How have your concepts served you? How do you relate to others? As soon as you ask, what am I? And what is this? Specifically, what is this more than anything? What is this reality? You're going to come to a lot of lofty ideas. You're going to come to a lot of interesting theories, and there's nothing wrong with that. But all the while that you're investing all this energy in developing these theories and stuff, there's a world around you that goes on completely without any nod towards the direction of your theories. And essentially, the goal of anything I say is not a how to live. And it's also, as I've made it clear, I'm not making a claim about the universe. I'm not saying what is or isn't, or what it is. I'm not saying it's all matter. I'm not saying it's all mind. I'm not saying it's all spirit. I'm not doing any of that. What I'm doing is trying to show that all of our theoretical pursuits are keeping us from experiencing what it is that we're living right now in the very short time we have to experience it. From one perspective, short. And we're missing it all the time because we're locked into these pursuits. And so on the topic of self-honesty, we need to admit when we're overlooking living our lives, being a part of nature in favor of hypotheticals, in favor of lofty cosmological bladder, and and we also, there's another dimension of self-honesty which I wanted to respond to something you said. You said that people want to seek peace. I'm not sure if it's true. I think, like you said, there's people like us who for some reason are born with some bug, some itch in us where we need to keep looking until that itch goes away. And when that itch goes away, that's what we call peace. But I feel there's also part of human nature is that there's many of us who don't want to be at peace. This is a very sort of paradoxical thing. It flips psychology on its head. Perhaps there are many of us who don't want to be well. We don't want to be well. We don't want to be at peace because then we would have to forfeit our illusions about control, our illusions about being right or wrong, our illusions about having the right perspective or the wrong perspective, the right technique, the right form of meditation, the right form of talk therapy. It's all a very veiled contest of ego. A lot of our pursuits of knowledge, it's all a very veiled contest of ego. And I think I'm qualified to speak on that because I was born not only with a seeker's disposition, but also an intellectual's disposition. I have a certain gift with words, and it's also the worst curse I could ever ask for, because it's very easy to get into a competition of who's right and who's wrong, and then to get back into the way of relating to yourself, where you're more concerned with finding the right answer than living the life you're going through. And so there's another dimension to self-honesty, the point I was rounding around to, where there's at least a little part of all of us which doesn't want to be at peace. If we really wanted to be at peace, as you said, we would find a way to be at peace. If you'd seek, you shall find. A lot of us, we say that we're seeking, but what we're doing is postponing. Because on some level, even if we don't want to admit it, we're attached to our unrest. And we're attached to our sensation that there's something wrong with ourselves and something wrong with the world. It's a very addictive sensation to play moral high ground and think you have the right way, and to get into these arguments with people, to get into debates about the right political policy, about who, what the right solution is and what's the wrong way. It's such an addictive sensation because it gives us the sensation of an identity, of a fixed identity. And so part of self-honesty, I think, is really admitting to ourselves that on some level we also don't want to understand ourselves. On some level we're afraid of understanding ourselves. On some level we don't want peace. We don't want wellness, and we don't want to get along with each other. This to me is just much more in line with the facts of how things are. And it may sound like I'm being negative or cynical. I'm not being negative. I'm trying with a sort of sense of humor to point back at the way we pull the curtains over our eyes, because only when we realize that's only when we can let the blind go all the way up and see what's in front of us. When we had the idea that we fundamentally want peace, then we can justify any form of postponing peace. If you want peace, grab it right now. Let go of all your assumptions. There's an emptiness that's here behind your mind, which is peace itself. It's the peace I speak from. It's the peace that those of us who are looking for. But we're looking out of that. That peace is always there. So we're playing it's the whole Hindu cosmology of Shiva playing a game with itself. What that really means is that the human being, not God, but the human being, is in a game where they're constantly pretending that they're seeking something, constantly pretending that they're looking for something. And when the curtain goes up at the end, they realize that there is nothing to look for. I know that conflicts with what you said, where you said, well, there really is something to be gained. Not in the way that we think. That's my caveat. There's not something to be gained in the way that we think. It's more about what we lose. Can we be strong enough to lose our fixed identity? Can we be strong enough to lose our point of view? And can we be strong enough to lose our belief structure? Only when all those things are gone will there be any sense of having gained something. And all that you gain is the understanding of what creates suffering and what doesn't, and also the understanding that we're all kind of tricky bastards. And when you understand that you're a tricky bastard, and I'm a tricky bastard, and all that, when you really understand that there's that trickster nature in our fucking blood, that's where self-honesty even becomes truly possible. Before that point, if we're locked in some sort of trick with ourselves, like I said, anything we do will be converted into another aspect of the trick. And so is it right for me to go out and expose the trick? I don't know. Maybe that's part of my trick. I don't know. And so all I can do is do what comes naturally to me. And that, I feel like that's really where the peace is right there, is realizing that all that you can feasibly do is something that comes naturally to you. Any strain that comes is from the insistence on trying to take someone else's moral system, moral code, and trying to apply it to yourself. You said that there is some way we can act harmoniously with each other. Yes, the way to acting harmoniously with each other is to stop needing to help each other in the same way we think we are, to stop needing to somehow save each other when we haven't saved ourselves, and to stop needing to influence the world. When that need goes, then you can adapt to whatever's around you in a very intelligent way without even trying. When that need is there, everything's a great effort. Someone says something to you and you watch your words very closely. You say, oh, I don't want to say this thing because if I say that thing, it might hurt this person. This is all based on, in a way, it's kind of a narcissism because we think that we know what that person needs. So we think we know what they should and shouldn't hear. Obviously, there's tact in how we should interact with each other, but there's a point where tact becomes very neurotic, where it becomes, like I said at the start of this discussion, a form of constipation. And trying to be mindful of giving you in and out. So here, I'm going to let you talk now.
Well, I think you brought up a lot of really good points. I do want to go back before I forget to a little example of, I guess, the piece that I'm seeing here that I guess is not being identified or that I'm not understanding. Back to like the we are all one, how it could be a catch. I totally agree. I mean, I see it all the time, but I think that's one of the really important things that I was trying to talk about earlier is that only happens if the person allows it to happen. You know, with the self-honesty work, there's a lot of pieces and parts to that. In my personal progress, at least, and as you achieve certain parts of it, more and more things crystallize and become clearer and clearer for the individual. The more honest you are, and not honest, accepting, and then moving forward with that. Like I can. There's a lot of. It's all about your true will. What you're trying to do with it. Are you just simply trying to observe how much of a piece of shit you are? Because that's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to observe what I am, no matter how much of a quote unquote piece of shit I am. Which I'm a wonderful person, but I make mistakes. I don't just do that to observe. I do it so that I can modify my behavior. And I think that with the whole "we are all one," you can you can choose to not choose by just letting things be, or you can take an active approach in your own thought processes. And that's a lot of the work that I've been doing for a while. That and with my shadow work, identifying who I really am, and making little modifications to go with more of the true self that I am, uncovering more of what I really want to be. And with the whole, the world is, we are all one. People, they can use that as an excuse. It can be a crutch, but it can also has a lot to offer. It's more like a tool. All of these concepts, they're just tools, and we can misuse tools. We can to use the "we are all one" as a crutch. You have to be self-dishonest to a certain extent, because you're not being honest about your own approach to it. If you're using it as a crutch to deny something, then that's not being self-honest. So the self-honesty work is actually a foundation for all other types of work, in my personal opinion. Because without a true foundation of self-honesty, everything can be skewed. You can fool yourself. You can be locked in these traps of self-mind. And so I think that the depth of discovering constantly new ways to be honest with yourself, because it never stops. I've been doing this work for like 6+ years pretty heavily. And exploring with myself and talking to a lot of other people on this journey. But I think that all of these things you're saying are true, but we get to choose how we interact with the world. And not all of us are aware enough or strong enough to be completely self-honest, but that, I think, is the journey. Being honest and loving to self opens up new possibilities of new tools in our belt to access a better life, and how to treat other people around us with kindness more and more, and to create the world around us that we want to see that alleviates discomfort in ourselves and in our communities. So I think that really it's our approach. We get to decide what we're going to do with these things. And I believe that, like I said earlier, the realization of what you're saying, that these things are just illusions, has merit and value. But I believe some of these systems also offer us a unique way of, like, let's say the "you are one" as an example still. I can relate to the world around me through that, and it can be a useful tool in the way I think about
spiritual energy or my community or how to actually live my life on a moment to moment basis that will make things more comfortable for myself and everyone around me, which is also a goal to apply. For me, my goal is to apply this stuff in my life to alleviate pain in my life and those around me. I guess I'm highly motivated by that. So there's a couple other things, but I actually forgot.
Well,
you just addressed quite a few things there, and a lot of really good points.
could I touch on what you just said then?
Of course.
Yeah. So okay. I understand where you're coming from, but I think on this one I'm gonna have to diverge some, because first of all, we should highly interrogate the idea that only seeking comfort for ourselves and others has been a net positive for us as a species, because it is the basic assumption on which all law and order and crusading and all that has been made, is that if you weed out the baddies and you keep the goodies, and you weed out the bad qualities and you keep the good qualities, then somehow that's going to make a perfect world. It's a complete crock. Like, it's a complete crock, because who are we to say what is good and what is bad? We can only understand what is good by its long-term effects, because it needs to be viewed in, like I said earlier, a teleological arc, which is our own evolution. There's a longer process going on. As soon as we try to decide what's the right way for this process to unfold, what's the wrong way, and to weed out the bad germs and keep the antibiotics, I don't know that this has been a good thing for us. I don't see it as a good thing, in the sense that I think it's created more conflict than it has helped it. Because the fact of the matter is that life is uncomfortable. Life is very uncomfortable. It's very uncomfortable to be a body. You have all these millions of things working each moment just to make sure your body is functioning. And it's not going to be a comfortable experience. The only way for it to be comfortable is for some form of dishonesty with ourselves to come in, where we start saying, oh, no, I'm really happy. I really feel great. I'm really at peace. And beneath that, there's a numbness. It's what we're calling comfort is a numbness. It's a lack of sensitivity. And I really do understand the perspective. I understand the idea that, okay, it's a temptation to resort to the kindness approach. In my experience, I really have to say, I'm not sure how helpful kindness alone is to anybody. And I say that as someone who I've faced a lot of difficult situations with other people enacting force on me, insulting me, whatever. I was really a really tubby kid, so I got picked on all the time. But man boobs and everything. But I really think that overall, it's sort of gotten me to a point where I was capable of respecting myself and understanding myself. All the disrespect that I've gone through has only helped to respect me. So, this is a fidgety sort of thing to dance on, because then people are obviously going to go, what? So do you recommend that we disrespect each other? Do you recommend that we insult each other? No, but I recommend above all else that you be truthful. There's a very real possibility with the approach of trying to be kind that we start doing things which we don't authentically mean. To me, as soon as we become inauthentic, rather than becoming cruel or good, rather than those categories of becoming virtuous or shameful, I think it comes down to whether we're authentic to what we really feel, what we really experience. or whether we're stepping around confrontation, stepping around communication. And I know this because I really spent most of my life trying to be that way. I tried to be the nice guy, tried to be nice. And, oftentimes I am pretty nice when I really feel like being nice. There's sometimes that I've also been forceful in the sense of really saying, no, I don't feel this way. If for instance, if we had this conversation and everything you said I would pretend to agree to, there would be no conversation at all. But that's the danger with trying to avoid discomfort at all, is that we start becoming a mimicry of ourselves. And we say, instead of communicating how we really feel, we place a higher value on saying what we think the other person wants to hear, specifically. What we think would cause them the least discomfort. This has gotten, I think this is one, the disasters, if you want to call it that. In the long run, it might not prove to be a disaster. That's kind of my point. It's been one of the disasters of the way we've progressed as a civilization, is that we've had the idea that we need to shelter each other, and that it's somehow right for us to pretend that everybody is right, pretend that everybody is perfect, pretend that we agree with everybody. If you start acting like you agree with everybody, you're not only going to stop saying anything meaningful, you're also going to really just promote a very flimsy way of relating to things, because if you try to agree with everything, then nothing is being said. And also, if you try to agree with everything, even when it disagrees with how you feel, then you're just promoting further confusion and conflict between two things which contradict each other. And there's one more point. You were talking about the oneness, that the all is one. Perhaps for someone out there, it's been a tool. But from what I've seen, it tends to not be a tool. Like I said, it's very possible to help a buddy of yours that broke down in his vehicle a few miles away, to go swing and pick him up. But your buddy doesn't learn how to look out for himself that way. That's the sort of line that I'm at least bringing into awareness, is that maybe sometimes the right thing to do is to be honest, even though it makes the other person hurt, though it makes the other person be uncomfortable. If I had never had someone who was willing to be honest with me and to hurt me, even with their honesty, I honestly don't know where I would be today. I'd be in a little bubble. And so it's not that I'm saying go out, be unkind. I'm saying if it's not your authentic impulse to be kind, then it's that by definition is a form of dishonesty. And that's pretty much what I've seen with the all is one stuff. It's a form of bypassing. They call it spiritual bypassing, where someone feels that conflict with something, yet if they can wave it away with the magic mantra, all is one, then they don't have to have any conversation with it. They don't have to acknowledge it. And in that sense, the all is one idea, besides the fact that I really feel like it doesn't even adequately describe the sort of thing I'm talking about. I'm not sure if that all is one, like we've been talking about, that reality might be plural, right? If reality is plural and there's no fundamental unity, then all we're promoting is an illusion when we say all is one. And if we don't know whether it's plural or whether it's one thing, then why are we saying all is one at all? We have our own personal motivations in it. And I think it really resonates with our sort of narcissistic condition. And when I say narcissistic condition, I'm not talking about one person or another. I'm talking about all of us. I've been definitely a narcissist for much of my life. But narcissist in a special sense, like everything I use in my own fucked up special sense. When I say narcissism, I mean we all have an obsession with observing ourselves, with relating to our own thoughts and feelings, and to maintaining that bubble. and trying to keep anything from popping it. And oftentimes when we say something's kind, what we're saying is don't pop the other person's bubble. Why should we keep ourselves from popping someone's bubble? I don't know. I want to pose that question to you instead of just, putting my own sound framework around it. I want to ask you the question of why should we refrain from popping another person's bubble?
Well, I think actually I don't believe that you should pop up people's bubbles. I think that that's not self-honesty. I believe that, or honesty, self-honesty is a foundation for how you're going to exist with the rest of the world. A foundation of everyone having self-honesty. Then, if everyone had self-honesty, they'd have all the layers peeled back, and they wouldn't get offended at least as much. Maybe like I've done a lot of work on self-honesty. I'm very aware of my shortcomings, almost to the point where it's been a bad thing. But when someone tells me something bad about myself, or something, communicates something that's not so awesome, just being a good friend, communicating with me, I don't always take it very well right off the bat. Sometimes I'll get a little defensive even still. But, a lot of times I'll just go, okay, that's your opinion. I'll either get offended or I'll say that's your opinion. And then I get the opportunity to do the self-honesty work. And sometimes they're right. And more often than not, they're wrong, or they're a little bit of both. It's something else being misconstrued or a communication error. But, a lot of times it's me. And the self-honesty work is brutal. It's absolutely brutal. That's the key. That's the core of it. But you gotta bring in the love part too. You gotta be brutally honest and accept it and love yourself. And then, in my opinion, you have to change or make as much effort as you can to change it. Because for myself, I know I'll get if I'm totally honest with myself all the time, then I don't change the things that I know I would not like to be. Then I start feeling bad about myself because I know that I'm doing things that I don't agree with. So like the self-honesty work is multifaceted. It's actually very complex to truly be honest with yourself and others, but not being an asshole to yourself and others. I think coming at it with love, coming at anything with love, doesn't mean you're always going to be Mr. Nice Guy. Sometimes love hurts, and you got to say some stuff that people don't want to hear. But it's a balancing act between just throwing it out there completely cold, and having a heart and trying to say things in a way. I guess what it comes down to is how is it going to be best received? Am I just saying this to be honest for myself, selfishly? Like, I was honest, you deal with it. Or am I going to say this in the way that you can best hear and perceive? Because as soon as we're threatened, we put those walls up, those filters. And so it's quite a complicated thing, but I definitely, to answer your question directly, I do not think that we should pull punches. I think that we should find the best, most loving way to communicate that. I think first for myself, I have to stop and say, do I even need to tell this person all this? Is this even my responsibility? Because you can't fix the world, And sometimes my heart says, yeah, you should say this. This is something that can help them, and they'll be able to receive it. But if I don't think they're going to receive it, I just keep my mouth shut, and I just try and be an example. I mean, I think that's going to turn more heads than anything, is trying to be, and I'm still in that mode. I'm still trying to be me, I'm still taking the layers away and trying to be what I believe in. I found out a long time ago, you can tell people stuff all day long, but unless they don't want it for themselves, if they're not seeking truly, they're not going to hear what I have to say. They're not going to understand. And they're going to find the reasons why it's wrong, and blah, 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 blah. But
yeah.
I really think it's our responsibility, to whether you're seeking understanding, whether you're seeking a no mind state, or the silence, or whatever it is you're seeking, you actually really have to want it to be able to achieve it. Otherwise, it's all going to be tricks. We'll all get lost in everything is one, if we're not really trying.
Yeah, that's a good point to jump from. Okay, so there's a few things there. I think I'll go with the most recent one first. You said you really need to want being in a state of no mind. I like that phrase because it's accurate. When you're in the state that I'm talking about anyways, you don't have thoughts, you don't have an identity, and you don't have a mind in any traditional sense. There's people, when I say this, they're literally astounded. What? You're crazy. How could you not think? Well, there's a reason that we feel like it's impossible to stop thinking. It's because we're addicted to thinking all the time. And it's a very rare thing for any of us to allow ourselves to experience not thinking, to experience having no mental activity. And there's an assumption that as soon as you have no mental activity, that you're in a cold, lifeless state, sitting still under a tree somewhere. This has been directly opposite to what I've experienced, and I wouldn't claim to never think. I had thoughts that come and go, but at least for some portion of every day, I'm in a state of no mind now. And it's a spectrum. But when I'm fully in a state of no mind, all of the activities that I would do if I wasn't going to second guess myself come completely effortlessly. For 8 years, I had known that I was meant to or wanted to write a book. It was only when I overcame, if you want to put it that way, the illusion of my mind, that I was capable of writing the book. I also wrote some other stuff, the novella album. Point is, that's all besides the point. The point is that I was able to do things I was never going to do before. So when you're not in a state of mind, and this is really proof of what I was saying before, where we think that we're using the mind to solve problems, but actually what it is a postponement of tackling our problems. It's a fear of tackling our problems. It's a fear of doing what we want to do. And that's where I would leap in and say, the issue is that it's a matter of what we mean by wanting, right? That's what I would say. Because if it's your mind that has a sense of, oh, I really got to get to a state of no mind, well, isn't that a contradiction? There's no such thing as a personality or identity or a mind on earth that wants the truth. The whole function of the mind is to obscure the truth. It's to resist the truth. And it's to keep us out of our natural state. That's how it acts anyways on a performative level. And so that's not to say that on some level, if we're doing all these things, then on some level, obviously, we want to understand ourselves. But it's a sort of subconscious form of wanting. So it becomes a thing where I'm not sure I would ever go and make the claim that you have to want the truth to get it, because that's only going to be misunderstood, because what we really want, for most of us, for the vast majority of us, we don't consciously know what we want. We do things really without understanding why we're doing them. And it's like the whole example of this whole spiritual path. In my case anyways, I was on this path, but I didn't know consciously at all what I was looking for. It's just a state of constant searching. You're looking for some meaning, some understanding, whatever it might be, but you don't know the target that you're aiming at. And so our authentic desires are unknown to us. And by the time they become known to us, it won't be important for us to have some sort of imparted knowledge about them. So I would say if you want the truth, you're going to find the truth, and it's not something you cannot choose to want the truth. If you think you can choose to want the truth, to me, that's, in my experience, and that's all I can base off of, is that for a long time I thought I wanted the truth too. When I first glimpsed the fact that my identity, my personal history, my sense of having a life that was somehow about me, fundamentally, the whole egoic structure, when I first saw really intensely that was a construct, I'll tell you, Chris, for 3 years, I ran and I ran. There was no valiant effort there. In the Bible, there's one section I read where Jesus says, Yeah, I say unto you that you will come to me 3 times before the cock crows. What he's saying, so when the cock crows, that means the sun's coming up, right? So it's a symbolic statement, which is usually how Jesus spoke. He's saying that you'll glimpse the truth over and over again, but then you'll run away again. And you'll come back. I'm not sure that any of us, and at least how we would typically mean our desires, desire the truth. What we do is we're led towards it. And then when we peek in and say, see what it implies, see the sort of responsibility it implies on one level, because it's taking responsibility for your own suffering and also taking responsibility for being an agent or a participating member in the unfolding process of human evolution, and also taking responsibility for the fact that on an unconscious level, you create situations which cause the suffering, and you also create situations which are self-serving, all these things. So it's a very difficult thing to confront, and that's the only reason I'm departing from you there, is because I want to be honest with people about the fact that none of us usually, this is the way I put it to one dude I talked to the other day. Yeah, a lot of people on Facebook ask me questions, they PM me and stuff. And he was asking me about fears on the path and things like that. And I told him that, to be honest, nobody sees a ravine and summons up the courage to jump into the ravine heroically and then comes heroically out the other side. What happens is that something happens which tosses you into the ravine, and by the time you come up the other side, still alive, still breathing, still kicking, you've developed a certain courage. You've developed the courage of seeing that even when you are on the brink of destruction or on the brink of total hopelessness, that somehow you made it through all those times. That every time you felt like this is the end, every time you felt like I'm a failure, you always came out of that. And when you see that, that's where courage develops. But there's no way to force ourselves to muster up courage, at least based on my experience, because as soon as you try to force yourself to muster up courage, it's coming from a place of fear. You're afraid. You're fundamentally afraid, so you say, I need to be courageous to get through this. Well, you're coming from a place of fear, so good luck getting courage out of fear. It's the same way with when we're miserable and we say, I really need to think positively. Positive thinking is another hoax, because as soon as you go to think positively, it's because you're already thinking negatively. You have a way of thinking which is causing you to suffer, so you say, I need to think positively. So what I'm really trying to outline here is just what I'm really ever trying to outline is the real way that our minds and bodies interoperate. And because my hope, anyways, my faith, I guess, in what I'm doing is, like I said, it's a form of mirroring. If I could be as honest as I possibly can about my own experiences and about my own pitfalls and about the way that I actually am, then maybe, just maybe, that will come across to someone and they'll be able to see themselves and to see their own unconscious and see how they're operating. If I go out there and I form some sort of teaching, some sort of doctrine, then it's giving a partial view and claiming that the partial view is the whole. There's no way I can do really all that is at my disposal. Really, that all that's at my disposal as a human being is to talk about my own experience. And that's the limitation I'm over and over again drawing a circle around. That there's no way I can talk about something outside my experience. And that's why I'm saying that there's a very definite limit to our knowledge, at least in the way we normally construe it. I don't know if I got away from what you said there, but I think I tackled it. So I'm going to let you go.
I think I would agree with pretty much everything you just said. It's like
usual, it comes down to definitions. I think to bounce back to the beginning of what you were saying on some of these self-honesty points, like when I was saying, the truth. To me, I guess the definition of truth is, a lot of the definitions I see is kind of two-dimensional. The way I see the truth is I can seek it to the best of my ability as much as I can see in the moment that I am, and get the understanding that I can get. And that is my truth in the moment. It's constantly changing. There is no one truth. There is one truth, but there isn't. That's a very multi-dimensional quantum concept. I think it runs true. But the truth as I see it on any specific issue is essentially, what do I feel is the most true, like honest, without having the filters, and how do I apply that in my life? And so I think when I'm looking for the truth on something, I try not to see it as something stable or black and white. I try and apply it to myself in a way that's productive, and then move on and let it be malleable and shift. I think that something as something solid really just denies the reality that things are multidimensional and always shifting. So I guess to address that, when I say the truth, it's not something that's a solid. It's something that simply offers a perspective that I can grow from, and then that's really all the use that it has. And then I try and seek the next truth using that as a foundation, I guess. And then, what was the last thing you touched on there?
I would be wholeheartedly lying to you if I said I remembered at this one.
I'm kicking myself. I'm not having a notepad out, but I'm trying to listen. I have a hard time writing down notes and actually listening at the same time.
Yeah, well...
Go ahead.
Yeah, I like what you said about the truth. Like I said, in my way of sort of reversing the way things are traditionally done, I would say, instead of seeking the truth, instead of looking at what's true, try to look at what's not true. Try to look at the beliefs you have and the ways that they don't totally line up with everything you've experienced. And try to look at the illusions you have, and try to deeply question the way that you assume things are. And that needs to be an absolute, complete ability to constantly keep questioning. Because...
Yeah, that's the foundation of self-honesty right there.
Yeah. There's going to be a point, like I said, like one of my first spiels was in this talk, I said, there's going to be a point where you realize that the questioning has become masturbatory and that is holding you back. But you need to have the ability until that point to question everything you know, because it's only going to be at the point where you're free of all beliefs. And I cannot stress that enough. If there's anything anybody can take away from anything I'm saying, it would be that freedom only comes when you're absent of your beliefs. It's only when you get rid of all your beliefs, when you clear out the attic, as it were, it's only at that point that anything is really going to fundamentally shift. So it's a really, I think it's counterproductive to ask what is true when we're starting off in a place of illusion. When we're starting off in a place of illusion, which we are, if you ask what is true, the only way you have to relate to the idea of a truth is through your own illusion. So don't ask what's true. Ask what isn't true or what might not be true. And don't put any limit on what that might be. Keep going down. And because when you reach the bottom, trust me, there's no way to question whether or not you've reached the bottom. Like I said, it fundamentally grips you. Yeah. But here I mean the bottom of the mind-based illusion. Obviously, we're always growing. But I think there's a very specific point any of us who are involved in this search can get to where our sense of identity is going to shift completely from the mental structure into our total being, which the way I put it usually, just to avoid any mumbo jumbo, is your sense of identity is going to shift from your brain to being the total organism that you are, the total individual and unique organism that you are. It's very hard to explain what that's like, but it's not something that you're going to be able to doubt, right? It's so unquestionable. It changes the way you literally, physically, sensorily experience what's around you. But until that point, all that you can do is keep asking yourself what might not be true. I really like name dropping one more time, because I've been sort of tactical with my name dropping during this for further resources for anyone who's interested. Yuji Krishnamurti, I like in one talk, he said, it's perhaps to your benefit to doubt that anything is real. It's perhaps to your benefit to doubt that even reality is real, because it's a subtle point, because only at that point where you're not even sure if anything is real, and I think a lot of us who have taken psychedelics have reached that point many times, it's only at that point, you have an opportunity at that point to let go of the assumption that anything's real, to go, okay, maybe this is a dream, then maybe it's the end. There's always going to be that point, that precipice of, I could die right now, to be point blank about it, that I've seen through the illusion. It's only at that point when you doubt the most fundamental assumption that you have, which is that you're alive, or that you're living in the real world. It's only at that point that you'll come to anything real, because the whole structure we're using to try to relate to reality is actually keeping us from reality. So at the basis of that structure is a belief that there is a person believing anything, and also a belief that there's something they believe in. When that fundamental point at the bottom of that drops out, everything else takes care of itself. So there's many dimensions that people talk about of spirituality that, to me, I don't see anything useful in talking about them, because there are certain stages and stuff that can only come after this happens. Up until that point, even if you don't realize it, because your mind is also automatic in some senses, it's a very habitual thing. Even if you think you're relating to reality, you're only relating to your own mind when the mind's there. It's impossible to relate to reality through your mind, because the mind is based on projections. It takes its own limited memory, its own limited understanding, its accumulated intellectual knowledge, and it sees everything through its lens. So we think that we're relating to each other and relating to the world, but it takes a very progressed person to be able to listen, to truly listen to another person. It's a great difficulty for us, because we're so trapped in this structure that even when we think we're listening, what we're really doing is going, okay, you're converting it into your own sort of very partial view. And it's not that that isn't unavoidable to an extent, but it is possible to get beyond this, where you can actually say, when you understand that your mind is based on projections, you can actually experience the experience of really listening to another being, really feeling what they're feeling, empathy, compassion, whatever, and getting beyond your own programming. But there's no possibility really of that for us beforehand. And that's been one of the major problems, like I keep pointing to, is that we've had all the best intentions in trying to help each other, but it's always gone awry. And the reason it goes awry is because we have this personalized mind structure, which is constantly tricking us and taking our basic feelings and using them against us. And what happens is that you think, I'm going to go out and help this person, but that possibility is not even there, because you can't relate to that other person as they are. If the mind is there, you can only relate to the image the mind has formed of that person. And that was, I think, really the main revelation or understanding I got from all the work I did with Carl Jung's work. So he talks a lot about projection. For me, that was really fundamental in understanding that I'm not principally relating to other people through my mind. I'm relating to only the images I can form of those people. And so it's only when you get beyond this image-making structure that you have any possibility of empathy, of true empathy. It's not that it might not peek through. It could. But it's not been what I've seen, and it's not been what I've seen in myself. And so I think there's really something I'm trying to drive at, which is that we need to accept our selfishness, because as long as we're fighting our selfishness, we're fighting the nature of our own mind, because the mind only sees itself. It's self-contained, and it is like a little fishbowl where everything that's refracted into it is going through its own glass prism. And all the images that form in the glass are only caused by the glass. They aren't actually accurate representations of the light that's shining on them. The mind's the same way. And for instance, if you're in a relationship and you have these weird, what you want, daddy issues, for instance, or which are real, daddy issues or mommy issues or whatever, all this past pain and stuff that gets projected. At that point, what's happened, and relationships are a great way to explore that, because all your projections are going to come out in a relationship. And at some point, you're going to break down communication, and both of you are going to be relating to your own mental projections. And until you get beyond the projection-making structure, you cannot reach out into the other and touch it. It's a very difficult situation where we're behind a wall of glass and trying to reach.
So you actually just cut out for a second. I don't know if you're aware.
Did I really cut out?
Yeah, but lost about 15 seconds of that conversation. It was ringing on my end. Then you picked back up, still talking. Sorry, brother.
Okay. And maybe I wasn't talking to the mic. I don't know. So
it cut off on my side here on Facebook for some reason, and then called you back and came right back into the conversation.
Oh, weird. Oh, so I cut out on Facebook?
Yeah, so maybe since you're recording on your end, that's probably still there.
Okay.
So you can probably just pick back up, and then I can edit that out.
Okay. Yeah, so what I was basically saying is that did you hear my fishbowl metaphor?
Yes, right. Fishbowl is right where it cut out.
Okay, good.
That was the last thing I heard.
So just as a fishbowl, all the light that's going into it is creating refracted images which don't accurately represent the light because they're being filtered through the glass of the fishbowl. That's how the mind works. And I gave the example of relationships with where what they call mommy or daddy issues come up. Because what happens at that point is there's a communication breakdown where both parties aren't relating to each other. They're relating to their own minds and thinking that they're relating to the other. And that's such a issue in all our miscommunications, is that we think we're capable of relating to another person as they are. But if we aren't sure of ourselves as we are, how can we possibly relate to the other as they are? Well, something has been so revelatory in my experience is the actual experience of having this mind mechanism shut off. And all of a sudden, when that shuts off, you see things as they are. You see that everything possesses its own reality, that really everything here is real. So I fundamentally disagree with the idea that the world is an illusion. The world is not an illusion. Our mental apparatus, which perceives the world through its own limited construct, that's the illusion. When that shuts off, you can actually have this experience of seeing that another being is completely self-existent apart from your own mind, from your own self. And that seems so obvious for us to say, that we say it's the whole object permanency thing, like, oh, the glass still exists if I'm not thinking about it. But you would think that's obvious, but there is all these myopic spiritual ideas out there about the world's just a projection of your consciousness, all this. It's all bullshit. It's all based on the way the mind perceives. It resonates with us because our mind perceives the world as if it's a projection of itself. When the mind shuts off, the world appears completely, stunningly, obliteratingly real. And that's the overwhelming experience of awakening. It's not that the world's a dream. That's only one level. If you're at the level where you feel like the world is a dream, keep going, because that's only one level. What awakening is realizing that all this that's going on is really fundamentally real. It's so stunningly real that we're incapable of processing it with our brains all the time, because it takes up so much energy to process how real the things outside of us are. So on one level, we are in a self-contained illusion, in a fishbowl, as I put it. And outside of that, there's something shining in, but we have no way of adequately understanding it. That's why I'm trying to bring people beyond understanding. Go beyond understanding into pure being. And when you're just being without any need to understand, that's the only point at which you have any hope of relating to the other as they are. Until then, for better or worse, we're in, like you said, two possibilities next to each other, but there's a wall in between them. That wall must fall. It's become maladaptive.
I definitely could agree with most of that. I think, again, the only disagreements, or not disagreements, but I don't know, ways that I would view things differently is just in the wording. I think that I could agree with everything you say. I think also depends on what audience you're talking to. You know, if you're talking to straight beginner people, regular people that have never really been introduced into some of the higher concepts, I think it is super crucial. I also think on some of the more quote unquote advanced levels, there are some understandings that can come after that. There are things that come after that, but I think that that's a fundamental way of, you can't get the true understanding until you reach that form of mind about the understanding, I guess is the way I would say it. I think we're saying the same thing, but you get caught up in trying to understand and you're not understanding it. Because like you said, it's a viewpoint. I really think that that's pretty crucial to this conversation, that everything's just a perspective. And there's so much information in this world, so much stuff our senses can't even perceive. But when we go into the no mind, then we lose the trying to perceive aspect, and we just find where we are in our current quote unquote location in reality, because that's what's relevant to us in that moment in time for whatever our purpose is, whether it to be at peace or just be, or whether it is you're trying to do something with that. I think fundamentally you must reach an understanding of what you're talking about to even be able to perceive what I would consider the next level. I think that the foundation, like that's why all the great masters meditate. You know, like, and they come in and out of meditations and speak sometimes to serve a purpose to help other people reach these states. And some masters will meditate for, you know, there's reported people that have been alive for hundreds of years in these meditations. You know, they're doing things, in my opinion, on other realms. They're doing other work. But I think it really has to do with where you're at, what you're trying to do. I think that there's a lot of different paths and purposes, and that all of these things hold ways of viewing things from a certain angle and view. And I know for myself, personally, I actually do believe I know what my purpose is and what I'm here to do and the work that I'm here to do. I know you said that you don't think it's possible to know that. I personally do think it's possible to know that. And I could be totally lost in an illusion of it, but I have clear goals set out in my spiritual progress, and I find that to be useful. But like I said the last time I mentioned something like that, I've also been bound up by that viewpoint. So I think that being able to hold that kind of viewpoint can be a little tricky. You know, you have to hold it quote unquote correctly. You have to hold it to the extent of which it's useful and not hold on to it as a fact.
which I think maybe sounds contradicting, and maybe that's not even the right way to describe it because of that. But I think that that's the way that I see some of these quote unquote understandings, or these places that can be held. Their perspectives, their ways of viewing things, that then in the future you can view things in a similar way to navigate, the realms. But I don't think necessarily we're disagreeing. I think it's just a different way of phrasing things.
Yeah. So actually, it's a slight misunderstanding of what I was saying then. I'm not saying that you can't know your purpose. I was more saying that the fact is that if we're at any point before understanding our purpose, we don't understand it. So any attempt to...
For sure.
Yeah. So, and also, there's a whole other thing, and I'm going to use an example of something you said earlier. You said whenever you start trying to think of sort of multidimensional reality, your mind starts getting very confused. And I think that's a very important point. On one level, sure, we can understand our purpose in the sense of what we are doing at this one point in a very long process that stretches out before us and goes after us. But I always am trying to view things from understanding that there's a much larger process that's been going on for a long time before me, and that's been going on a long time after me. So how can I don't know that in an ultimate sense I can understand my purpose until in some future generation, whatever I've done during this life is contextualized within their framework. But in the sense that I can have a very definite intuitive understanding of what I'm meant to do, of what I'm doing, yes, and I can go out and do it. But only tomorrow is going to be able to discern the meaning of that thing. And that's kind of what I mean.
Totally.
That's what I mean. It's a very it's a subtle thing. Like a lot of what I'm saying, like you mentioned to me before our talk today, is it's you don't realize how subtle it is when I'm trying to say it. It takes some time to seep in. So what I'm saying is that just the reason your mind gets confused when it thinks of a higher dimensional reality is because your mind is of the three-dimensional reality, right? So how could it possibly comprehend something more complex than itself? And this is sort of the real stark thing I keep coming back to and back to for our knowledge. How can we possibly use this instrument to understand ourselves if the thing that it's trying to understand is more complex than it is? And so that's really what I'm saying. And also, it's the same with any of our lives. We can understand our lives, but if our lives viewed from a larger perspective are part of another process, then how can we understand with our lives the total meaning of our lives? It's the same way that, there's so many starving artists throughout history who are hugely influential now and are considered masters of their art. They weren't known at all during their lifetime. One of my favorite authors, Philip K. Dick, science fiction writer, he was really in poverty for most of his life, and now he's considered one of the best American writers and all these things. But he never really saw much of that recognition during his life. So that's kind of what I'm saying. We can't see the most complex process. We can't see the largest process because we're part of a smaller process. So only through understanding our fundamental limitation are we going to be able to effectively do what we feel like we should do. If we constantly put ourselves to an impossible task, that's what I'm drawing our attention to, is that we're putting ourselves constantly to an impossible task, which is trying to understand the universe or trying to understand reality. It's much better to try to understand yourself, because then you're working with something which is on the same level of complexity as itself. The world is obviously more complex than yourself is because it involves many selves, many individual organisms, many branches of life and interacting natural systems. So how is there any way to comprehensively understand something that not only is more complex than you are, but is also much more vast, and it's also always changing. It's always changing. By the time you go to understand it, it's already changed again. And there has to be some fundamental click that we're setting ourselves to an impossible task, that throughout history, so many of our pursuits of so-called human knowledge have been setting themselves to an impossible task. And who are you to say what's possible, right? I think it's just a matter of being realistic. And I think it's a matter of seeing also where our theories have failed us and where they've set us against each other. If our theories are setting us against each other, if our theories are separating ourselves from life, then what value are those theories really outside of some sort of theoretical value? And I guess my whole thing comes down to it's time to drop the act. It's time to let go of the act. If we want to thrive and survive as a species, I'm not promoting any illusion of brotherliness or universal brotherhood. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about accepting the basic nature of who we are. And that also includes the way that we feel separate from each other. It includes all of that.
Yeah, well, I think it's super important. I mean, I think that, like I said earlier, all of these things are different perspectives and tools to be used at whatever time is applicable. I do think, as far as earlier, we both touched a bunch on understanding and I guess what I'm trying to get is I think as you raise your frequency, when we were talking about being on 3 dimensions and only understanding things in 3-dimensional mind, those kinds of things, I think tools like no mind and the silence and these different states of mind, I really do believe that there's the ability to raise one's frequency and go and raise yourself out of the 3-dimensional. And I think that's part of what the awakening process is raising yourself to a frequency which I believe is measurable. I don't know if you're familiar with Gerald Clark's work at all. He does the Anunnaki stuff, but he also is a computer scientist of some type, and he measures the aura, and you can convert, the frequency into the color. You can use the colors converted into a frequency, and they actually match up, and you measure the different chakra points and stuff. So I think my own personal research, I don't want to go into a bunch of that, but I've seen, for me, my own data that proves to me that there is a raising and lowering of the frequency, and consciousness flows with that. So I think that some of this work is to raise the actual literal frequency of the body and the energetic ability of the body to raise it to a frequency high enough to understand these things. Now, I don't think that those higher understandings are communicatable through language. I think that's the true language is thought form. And I think most of the stuff that we've been talking about and a lot of these higher spiritual concepts, they're not really relatable in language. Language is too low of a frequency. It's like trying to describe an entire nature scene. You could write a book on all the things you see standing in the forest, but it will never compare to the person standing in that forest, being in that moment looking. And I think these understandings are like standing in that forest. And we use analogies and parables and all these things to try and convey our particular understanding, our perspective in that moment. But they're always going to fall short. And that's where the seeking for the self comes in. If one wants to have any type of true applicable understanding in one's own life, they actually have to find these things out for themselves, using the conversations like this as let's say like the handrail in the dark as you're kind of feeling yourself around. These are just suggestions, but I think one has to find their own path to find an understanding, and 2 people may not come to the same understanding. I think that's part of the complexity of the universe. But I think there are generalities. There are ways that the particles coexist in patterns. There's a pattern, I guess. And we can also use the pattern. The more we seek, the more we learn, the more points on that pattern we find, the more we have to navigate. So I think that all these things really have truth, and they're all necessary. They're all pieces of the puzzle
to be used as tools when needed, and to not be used when it's going to be a hindrance. But it's still, I think, the fundamental aspect is the person really has to want to go forward and face whatever it is that is giving them that filter. It's like layers of an onion, spiritual progression. Just got to keep peeling those layers back. And also, I think like what you're saying is a really important point. Stripping it all away and just being is a big headline I'm hearing from you. And I know for someone like myself, I've approached the problem as a problem to be solved my whole life. And until I started dabbling more with meditation and learning more about how things can be two things at the same time and trying to bend my mind in that weird way, it's like doing mental yoga while drunk. None of that stuff really made sense to me because I wasn't actually living in the moment with these concepts. So for myself, I know the work that I had to do is to let all this stuff that I've acquired go so that it can actually hold relevance for myself. But I guess I never would have gotten to this point where I'm at if I hadn't have worked really hard and studied all the different religions. But I do think that I know for myself, Spirit has told me directly that I need to develop my intuition and my letting go side, and more than I need to exercise my intellectual side because I'm off balance.
Yeah, well, it's a sort of imbalance, like I said, that really is infecting us as a species as a whole. It's an imbalance between this instrument, like I said, that we've been addicted to. We call it thinking, whatever, and actually existing as a body in the world, as an organic being, as a animal, really. And I'll touch on a few things you said. Then maybe soon, do you want to get to wrapping it up? Because I have to piss and and all right. Can you hear me, Chris?
Sorry, my mute button was on.
Oh, it's all right. Yeah.
Yes, I'm fine with that. We're getting over 3 hours here.
Okay. So you mentioned raising the vibration of the body. It's a good example, and the chakras also. It's not that I'm not here to denounce any of this, but what I am here to do, since we're talking about a specific thing, which is awakening, coming to a natural state, presuming that I'm someone who's experienced this, I'm trying to give an accurate description of what this actually is so that there won't be illusions formed about it. And one distinction I make all the time is that awakening is not a mystical experience. We've all had mystical experiences. I've had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. It's not a mystical experience. It's a fundamental transformation in the way that you experience yourself on a physical level. And so I agree that, yeah, there has to be some transformation in the body. The difficulty is whenever you have some goal in mind, like I want to raise the vibration of my body, or I want to align my chakras, or all this, that may be fascinating. It may even produce some interesting results. You'll probably have some great experiences doing all that. But none of these experiences are awakening, and they're not the fundamental understanding of what creates our suffering, why we suffer, and how to be free from suffering, which is how the Buddha did define enlightenment that way. And I would agree with his definition anyways, in that extent. There's a difference there, because someone can have the most extravagant mystical experiences. A buddy of mine named Atlas on Facebook, he's given the example in conversations with me where he said a yogi, for instance, can be a real technical marvel. They can be able to stretch their fucking ankle over their neck in the most extravagant ways. They can be able to do the most amazing things. Perhaps they can even perform some form of miracles, whatever. You hear all these crazy stories. But none of that is gnosis. None of that is understanding of oneself. All it is a relative performance. And so it's what, even for me, a big thing for me was that I eventually had to overcome my attachment to psychedelic drugs as a way of understanding, because they did help me understand a lot, particularly mushrooms. But it got to a point where even that wasn't enough. The experience is only temporary. Even if it's a genuine experience, even if it really tells you something, you're most likely going to lose a lot of that on the way out, and it has to end. So all of our experiences have a beginning, middle, and end. And all of the processes we enact, if I raise my body to a higher vibration, perhaps that will work. But the difficulty is that at some point that's going to have to end also, because the body cannot maintain a state like that forever. At some point it's going to have to rest. And that's the very important point I want to make, is that it's not about any state. It's not about infinite bliss. It's not about getting to a place of omniscience. It's not about any of these things. It's not about any of these high and lofty things. I want to make it known that liberation is something very ordinary, and that all it is fundamentally understanding what you aren't and what you are. And that understanding is not contained in any experience. It's not contained in any technique. It's not contained in any process. So, because understanding is something that stays with you. Experiences come and go. Techniques come and go. States come and go. I'm not here to denounce or approve of things like aligning your chakras or raising your vibration or communicating with entities through a medium, or all these millionfold multitude of things we can do. On some level, we're eventually going to come to an understanding, at least I did in my process, where I came to understanding that even on some level, all these things are a form of entertainment. We're entertaining ourselves with all these teachings. We're entertaining ourselves with all these experiences. And perhaps we do take some things away from them, but we also lose some things on the way out every time. And so none of that is going to offer any lasting relief to our suffering, right? None of that is going to offer lasting relief. It may offer the sort of relative relief that your friend has when you go to pick him up when he's broken down, like I said. But that's a relative good. It's a relative pleasure. It's not what I'm talking about, which is beyond pain and beyond pleasure, which is a total understanding of your mind, total understanding of your being, and total understanding of yourself. And which, like, contrary to what you had thought I was saying, it is possible. That's what I am saying. It is possible to know yourself. It's all that you can know, however, because as soon as you try to go beyond yourself, you're trying to get beyond a process which you are and going into something which is much more complex than you. And if someone wants to try to go beyond that, I applaud them, because they're trying to do something which, for all intents and purposes, is very unlikely, and that there's a certain courage to that, but also there's a certain masturbatory quality to that, which is what I'm saying. It's the same way I feel about, for instance, the space program. We're sending rovers to Mars. We're sending all these things up into space, and we haven't even understood what it means to be on this planet. So what is our motivations in doing that? We invent all sorts of virtuous narratives that is to increase our understanding. To me, it's really a form of escapism. We're trying to get away from confronting the problems that need to be confronted, which are right in front of us. It's a form of postponement. And all of the techniques we have, no matter what they are, run the danger of becoming that. That does not mean, I'm not saying to never try any technique. You need to experiment. You need to experiment with everything you can experiment with. I'm just talking about the if you want to call it the ultimate end goal or nature of what these things are. Like you said, there's many stages, of course. But if I were to try to talk from the perspective of someone at a lower stage, I would be going against what I know and what the view I've developed of those stages now. So instead, I find it most useful anyhow to just be honest about what I found. And then, like you said, people will use it as a tool in their own way. And the only way anyone's ever going to come to understanding themselves is honestly getting thrown off into the ravine, like I said. And when you come out the other side, you'll have courage, you'll have understanding and stuff. But until that point, you're going to use everything you can use as a guardrail, as you put it. And the guardrail may help you for a little bit. It may produce some effects, but then it's going to fail you again. And what I mean by failure is it's going to come to a point where you're going to realize there's still something that's missing. There's still something that hasn't clicked. So by all means, I invite everyone to go out and try every possible technique. Do all of it, because the quicker you get it over with, the quicker you'll realize what it is you're really looking for.
Yeah, I think it's a solid statement. I mean, I don't find myself looking for a whole lot anymore because I have not by any means acquired all of the knowledge and transmuted it into wisdom. But there's a certain point where you can only absorb so much. I mean, I've tried to watch every YouTube video and get my hands on every book, and like you can only consume so much data. There is definitely a limit, and I've hit that. And luckily, Spirit told me, at one point, because I wasn't quite getting it. Like I knew, but it hadn't really solidified. It was like, dude, through all these circumstances, the message became very clear. You got to work on the other side. If you've been on this, what is it, the left brain or whatever one is, like the one that does all the technical crap. I've been existing on that side of my brain for a long time, and I have to now work on these other aspects, which are a little more difficult for me, but that's going to bring the balance that I need. And I think since we live in a very male energy driven society, a lot of us, especially in the business world and all these things, people are very, we live mostly on half of our brain, and to balance the hemispheres is actually extremely healthy, neurologically speaking. But also I think that has a lot to do with the imbalance in us. I think has a lot to do with our constant seeking. We're constantly imbalanced one way or the other, seeking the other half of ourselves. And it's just something to say, but it also has some meaning, I mean, I'm literally trying to do things with my left hand that I do with my right, and trying to be more creative and write and express and do more videos and art now, because the way that I process things is to kind of backwork them. And so I know I'm unbalanced, so I do things that promote the other side of the brain more, and also seek more of the state of mind that we've been talking about, the peace of mind, and that brainwave state actually is where all the healing happens. So I think not only on a spiritual and contemplative level, but I think that on a 3D living your daily life level, all these things are something that we can all do. I think that's the thing. So we can all do it. It's possible. It's right there.
Yeah, exactly. Like I said, I'm trying to make it understood that this is something that's ordinary. It's something that's the birthright of anyone that wants to go looking for it. It's something that's there for all of us. It's not Godman. It's not becoming God. It's not becoming all these crazy, high, lofty concepts. It's actually, in some ways, the opposite of that. It's accepting your mortal nature, accepting that you are what you are, which is the most obvious thing, which none of us want to fess up to, which is that we are these organisms that we go around as. And that's where I meet so much heat from other spiritual people as they go, no, you're a spirit, you're a soul, you're this or that. Maybe that's what they found. That's not been what I found. What I found is that when all these identities were stripped away from me, what was left was this physical body, and that it was able now to function much more harmoniously within itself, feels much more at peace with the world, much more comfortable because it has accepted its own nature. As I explain in a video on YouTube, if anyone wants to look it up, my YouTube is Zebra Love, and the video is called something like self steering bodies on autopilot, or something like crazy trippy sounding. But I had this theory where the body is still largely unconscious of its own functioning. So when we talk, for instance, about this Alan Wattsian idea of you are the universe trying to understand itself, my divergence from Watts would be that we are these immensely complex physical organisms trying to understand themselves, and we are individuals. We aren't all the same being. We aren't all the same creature. And like I said, I really feel like this non-dualist hogwash has been one of the biggest obstructions for people looking for the truth, because no matter how much you look for one universal self, which we all are, I guarantee you will not find it. I guarantee you won't. All that you'll find is that the more you try to look for it, the further away it gets. What you're looking for is yourself, and what yourself is the thing that's doing all this looking, all this experiencing. What is it? It's the human body. The human body is trying to understand itself, and so has created what we call the mind, created the ego, gone through this big historical process. And it's one historical process out of many. We're reaching the end of one. Check your watch. The watch, not on your wrist, but the watch in your gut. Ask yourself what time it is, and you'll start to get a sense of where one age ends and the next one begins.
There you go.
Good ending, huh?
That was well said. I like that. Yeah, that was good. That was great.
So do you want to finish it there? Or?
Yeah, that's a good spot. You want to plug your website and any that kind of stuff you want to throw in there? I know you just mentioned your YouTube name, but any of that kind of information you want to throw out there?
Sure. So my name is Zebra. I'm talking with Chris here. And if you are interested in hearing any more of my blathering, I would recommend first looking me up on Facebook, because that's where I do a lot of work. My Facebook is Zeebs, Zeebs, Haver, Haver. I have a YouTube, which is Zebra Love, which is spelled how it sounds. And then I have a book, a novella on Amazon, which you can look up. It's also available as an audiobook on my YouTube, and it's called The Indwelling. And I think that's the extent of my work. I mean, I have music too, but it's unrelated.
Well, awesome. Thanks for sharing this wonderful conversation. I really appreciated all of your viewpoints, and I look forward to our next Hangout sesh.
Yeah, man, it was awesome. It was a lot of fun. I'm going to end the recording.